Welcome, welcome. You're here at Fiction Moon. Today we present to you, What If Harry Was a Primordial Shadow Dragon Reborn in Privet Drive and His Aura Made Dumbledore Freeze? Like and subscribe if you want more awesome stories. Sit back, relax, and enjoy. Chapter 1, The Weight of Old Bones. The neighbors on Privet Drive had a theory about the Potter boy. Mrs. Fig started it, the way she started most things, over tea, in her cat-smelling sitting room, with the particular relish of someone who has been observing something for years and finally found an audience willing to listen. She said it to Mrs. Number 7, who told it to Mrs. Number 12 over the garden fence, who mentioned it to the woman at the post office with the reading glasses on a chain, and from there it traveled the way neighborhood gossip always travels, softly, persistently, finding every crack. The theory was this: there was something wrong with the Potter boy. Not wrong in the way they sometimes said it about other children on the street, not disruptive wrong, not troublemaking wrong, not the shouting and the breakages and the general exhausting wrongness of badly managed children. Wrong in a different register entirely. Wrong in the way you feel standing at the edge of a very deep forest in late afternoon when you realize, slowly, that you cannot hear any birds. Harry Potter was 10 years old and he had never once, in the entire collective memory of Privet Drive, thrown a tantrum. This would have been unremarkable if everything else about him were unremarkable. But there was also the matter of the Dursley boy, who had stopped tormenting him 2 years ago with no explanation offered to any of his friends or his parents. There was the matter of the neighborhood cats, a rotating population of strays and domestic escapees, who gathered on the garden fence of number 4 on summer evenings and sat there watching the backyard in the specific attentive way that cats reserve for things that interest them beyond ordinary explanation. There was the matter of the time the Polkiss boy had cornered Harry near the park and come home 20 minutes later unwilling to say anything about what had happened, only that he didn't want to go near Privet Drive anymore. And there was the matter of Harry's eyes. People noticed them and then tried not to. They were green, which was ordinary enough, but the green of them was the green of deep water or old forests or the particular shade the sky goes just before a storm decides what it's going to do, a green that seemed to have depth to it, layers, as though you were looking not at the surface of something but into the interior. Children stared at them openly, with the honest tactlessness of children. Adults looked and then found somewhere else to put their eyes. Harry was aware of all of this. He had always been aware of it. He sat with the awareness the way you sit with weather, present to it, noting it, undisturbed by it. He was in the back garden on the morning the letter came, sitting on the back step with a piece of toast and a library book about deep-sea bioluminescence, watching a garden spider build something between 2 rose canes. The spider was making extraordinary structural decisions. Harry had been watching it for 25 minutes and felt it was worth continuing to watch. The letterbox rattled at the front of the house. The ordinary papery sound of Morning Post. And then underneath that, threaded through it like a second melody under the first, something else, not a sound exactly, more a recognition, a vibration in some register that had nothing to do with ears. Harry's head came up from his book. His eyes went distant. He knew what it was. He finished his toast, closed the book on a folded corner, and went inside. The envelope was sitting on top of the pile the way important things sometimes sit, not pushed to the front, not making a fuss about itself, but present in a way that made everything around it seem temporarily beside the point. Thick parchment, yellowish-green ink, a wax seal showing a crest he recognized without having seen it before. He picked it up and held it for a moment. The magic in it was layered and deliberate, tracking enchantments, an addressing charm of considerable sophistication, the deep structural warmth of wards built over centuries and maintained with care. And underneath all of that, something the builders of those enchantments had certainly not intended and very likely did not know was there, a resonance, brief and clean as a struck bell, like one old thing recognizing another across a great distance. Harry turned the envelope over, read the front, and went back to the garden to finish watching the spider. He already knew what the letter said. He had known this was coming in the way he knew most things were coming, not through reading or being told, but through an understanding of how causes and consequences arrange themselves, how the shape of a past event throws its shadow forward into the future. A curse deflected 11 years ago. A boy who should have died and hadn't. A school that had been sending a letter to this address for the past 3 days, each iteration growing slightly more insistent. He thought Hogwarts had a finer sense of occasion than he usually gave institutions credit for. Arriving at the same moment as the boy's 10th birthday, there was some poetry in that, even if the poetry was coincidental. The spider finished the outermost ring of its web at 9:30. Harry applauded it quietly and went in to start on breakfast. Vernon Dursley descended the stairs at 8:30 with the specific gravity of a man who has decided to get ahead of something before it gets ahead of him. Harry was already in the kitchen, which Vernon had been trying to adjust to for years without notable success. Something about Harry in the kitchen, moving efficiently between the stove and the counter, making food without being asked and without making mess, was deeply unsettling to Vernon in ways he couldn't articulate. Vernon collected the post from the hall. Harry heard the pause. Heard the sound of an envelope being picked up and then turned over, and then the too careful sound of a man deciding to take his time. Harry didn't look up from the eggs. "Nothing interesting in the post today," Vernon said, from the doorway. Said Harry. "Bills, mostly. Bit of nothing." Vernon's voice had a particular quality when he was lying. It went up about half a register and became simultaneously too casual and too detailed. It was one of the most reliable tells Harry had ever observed. "Junk mail. You know how it is." "I do," said Harry. He served Vernon his breakfast, ate his own at the small section of counter he'd claimed as his default position over the years, and said nothing more about it. Vernon looked at him several times through the meal with the expression he always wore when he was waiting for Harry to do something unpredictable, and Harry ate his eggs and read his book about bioluminescent deep-sea creatures and let him wait. The letters came on Tuesday, 6 of them, all addressed to Mr. H. Potter, the cupboard under the stairs, all collected and burned by Vernon in the kitchen sink with a performance of casual indifference so studied it was practically theater. Harry watched from the doorway, noted the detail about the cupboard with something that might have been mild amusement, and said nothing. On Wednesday there were 12. On Thursday, 30 arrived through the fireplace, which Harry thought was the letters escalating the effort in a way that suggested the school's charm work was at least partly autonomous and had opinions. Vernon made sounds like a man coming apart at the structural seams. Petunia swept ash and didn't meet anyone's eyes. On Friday, 100 letters arrived by owl. 100 owls, organized with military precision, descended on number 4 Privet Drive at 7 in the morning in a storm of wings and talons and the kind of noise that made the neighbors come to their windows and stand there in their dressing gowns looking confused. Dudley screamed. Vernon went the color of old brick. Petunia had a moment where she stood very still in the kitchen with her eyes closed and her hands pressed flat on the counter, doing the private internal negotiation she performed several times a day when she needed to function and the available information made functioning difficult. Harry stood at the living room window and watched the owls and thought they were beautiful. By Saturday morning, Vernon had a plan. The plan was, in essence, to drive until the letters couldn't find them. Harry understood the appeal of this plan from an emotional standpoint and its fundamental uselessness from a practical one, but he felt that explaining this to Vernon would help no one and deprive him of what was shaping up to be a genuinely interesting journey. So he packed his bag, the photograph, the stone, the deep-sea book, and a change of clothes, and got in the back of the car. Dudley sat in the middle of the back seat, which he filled comprehensively. Harry sat against the window and watched Surrey give way to the motorway and the motorway give way to smaller roads and smaller towns and the increasing general impression of a man driving with the fixed purpose of someone who believes that geography, if accumulated in sufficient quantity, constitutes a solution. Harry found it restful. He liked motion. He liked the blurring of ordinary things at speed, the way the world outside a car window turned itself into something abstract, color and shape and suggestion rather than lawn and fence and street sign. He liked the way England accumulated in depth as you moved away from its southern cities, the way the stone in the walls got older and more patient-looking, the way the hills became more serious about themselves. They stopped twice for petrol. Dudley ate a remarkable quantity of crisps. Vernon's knuckles on the steering wheel went white and stayed white. Petunia stared at the road ahead with the expression of a woman who had a great deal of practice pretending things were not as they were. No letters found them for most of the day, and Harry watched Vernon begin, gradually, to breathe. They ended at a hut on a rock in the North Sea. The hut was everything a hut on a rock in the North Sea in a thunderstorm should be: cold, small, damp at the corners, and possessed of a smell that was approximately equal parts old wood and seawater. The windows shook in their frames when the wind hit. Rain came in sideways and found every gap. The single light bulb swung on its cord and made the shadows move in ways that Dudley, stuffed into a corner with his portable games console, clearly found oppressive. Harry found it magnificent. He lay on the floor of the smaller room with his jacket spread under him and listened to the storm with the appreciative attention of a connoisseur. He liked violence in weather that wasn't directed at anything in particular, the indiscriminate fury of the North Atlantic in July, all that energy with nowhere to go but out. He lay on the floor and felt the rock under the hut through the layers of wood and damp concrete, felt the rock's absolute certainty about itself, and found something in him unwind that had been wound tightly for a long time. He was not afraid of the dark. He was not afraid of the storm. He was not afraid of the night passing slowly toward midnight, which was the hour he had a quiet, unexamined certainty was relevant. He counted the waves for a while. Then he sat up and counted breaths. Then he reached into his bag and found the stone he'd picked up at the park when he was 6, black, smooth, roughly the size of a large marble, and held it in his palm. The stone had no magic in it by any wizard's definition. It was simply a piece of rock that had been in the right place at the right time to absorb something. The first time Harry had held it, the resonance had been like finding a door in a wall you'd been walking past for years, not surprising, exactly, but clarifying. It vibrated in a frequency below sound and below magic, something deeper, something that the word primordial gestured toward without fully reaching. He held it and waited for midnight. The storm was doing something impressive with the windows when it came, a crack of thunder that arrived at the same moment as a knock on the door. Not a polite knock. A knock that would have stoved in a sturdier door than this one, delivered by a fist that could have done the same to a small wall. Harry put the stone away and stood up. He heard Vernon, in the main room, say something loud and frightened and offensive. He heard the voice from outside reply, a voice like a rolling boulder, warm and massive and slightly muffled by the storm, saying something about Hogwarts letters. He heard Vernon go for something near the door, the specific metallic sound of a man making a decision he had probably practiced in his head. Harry walked out of the small room and stood in the doorway. The hut's door came off its hinges a moment later. Just came off, simply and completely, as though it had been waiting for permission. And Rubeus Hagrid came in out of the storm and the dark and the horizontal rain, and he was soaking wet and magnificent, his beard dripping, his coat plastered flat, an umbrella in his hand that was doing something to the weather around it that the local weather clearly found objectionable because lightning kept trying to strike nearby and getting redirected. He stepped on the shotgun first. Stepped on it the way you'd step on a pencil, by accident, with no drama, a brief grinding crunch, and then his attention moved elsewhere. Vernon made a sound like the world had ended. Then Hagrid turned and found Harry in the doorway. He had big eyes for a big man, dark and deep and genuinely expressive, and Harry watched everything move through them in rapid sequence: expectation, surprise, recalibration, something more complex. The assessment that happened next was not human speed, not the conscious working out of an impression, but the older animal calculation that happens below thought, in the place where instinct lives. Hagrid looked at Harry the way a dog sometimes looks at a thing it cannot fully categorize, with attention, and with a low, steady alertness. Then he smiled. It broke across his face like genuine sunrise, warm, entire, unmanaged. "Harry," he said. "Not surprised. Delighted. The way you say someone's name when you've been wanting to for a long time and the moment has finally arrived. Last time I saw ya, you were just a baby." "I know," Harry said. "You carried me out." Hagrid's smile shifted into something more careful. "How d'ye know that?" "I remember it," Harry said. Not the way you remember things, exactly. But I remember you. He did. He remembered the enormous arms, the smell of wood smoke and grief and leather, the sensation of being carried at great speed through cold air with the stars overhead. He remembered the weight of those arms, careful in the specific way that very large, very strong things are careful with small fragile ones, and the way the grief in them had been enormous and genuine and not at all concealed. He had liked Hagrid even then. He liked him now. Right, Hagrid said, faintly, and then seemed to recover himself by locating the birthday cake in his coat, which he produced with the pride of a man who has been looking forward to this moment. It was chocolate, slightly squashed, and red Happy Birthday Harry in pink icing that had survived the journey by miracle or determination. Made it myself. Harry accepted it and tasted it immediately, because it would have been unkind not to. It was excellent, dense and real and not too sweet, the kind of cake that someone made because they wanted the person eating it to enjoy it, not because they wanted to be seen to have made a cake. Thank you, he said. Genuinely. Hagrid beamed. In the background, Vernon had been reconstituting himself since the shotgun incident and had now reached something like functional outrage. He began to speak at volume about laws and rights and his house, which last point Harry thought showed a limited relationship with the concept of real estate. Hagrid dismissed him with the easy completeness of a man who has been dealing with Vernons his entire life and doesn't find them interesting, and Vernon subsided not because he'd been threatened, Hagrid didn't threaten him, just ignored him, but because being ignored by something that large was in itself a kind of message. Dudley, who had appeared in the doorway of the other room to see what the noise was, looked at Hagrid, looked at Harry, and very quietly sat down on the floor. Hagrid was explaining about Hogwarts now, building up to it with the care of a man who had rehearsed the speech and expected to need it. Harry let him build for a while, genuinely enjoying the preparation, before he said, "I know about Hogwarts." Hagrid stopped. "I know about the school, the term starting September 1st, the train from King's Cross. I know about what happened 11 years ago on the 31st of October in Godric's Hollow." He paused. "I know about Voldemort." Hagrid flinched the way everyone flinched at the name, a full-body response, involuntary, like touching something hot. Harry noted it with academic interest. "How?" Hagrid said. Not quite a question. More the sound of someone buying themselves time to process. "I pay attention," Harry said. "There's also the matter of what I am, but that's a longer conversation." Hagrid stared at him. Then he said, with complete honesty and no attempt to dress it up, "Yeri, not what I was expectin', dot." "What were you expecting?" "A scared kid," Hagrid said. "Confused. Maybe overwhelmed. Maybe cryin', dot." He scratched his beard. "I brought extra handkerchiefs. I appreciate the preparation." "Didn't use M on you before," Hagrid said, with a kind of wondering look. "Used M on myself, if I'm honest. That night. After I left, yeah." Harry felt the weight of that, 11 years of accumulated grief, the specific grief of someone who had been given a sleeping baby and driven through the night and handed it over like a package and gone home alone to a dark house. He felt it the way he felt most things people carried, as a texture, a temperature, something he could read as clearly as print. "He was a good man," Harry said quietly. "My father. And she was a remarkable woman. I think you loved them." Hagrid's jaw worked. His eyes went bright and liquid. "Don, go doin' that," he said, and his voice was not quite steady. "I'm sorry," Harry said, and meant it. "I shouldn't have said that without warning." "How d'ya?" Hagrid stopped, took a breath, rebuilt himself. "How d'ya know what people are feelin'?" "Yeah, been doin' that this whole conversation." "I've been doing it my whole life," Harry said. "I can't turn it off. Mostly I try not to comment." Hagrid looked at him for a long moment, in the way Harry had become accustomed to being looked at, the gradual dawning of something, the recalibration, the small adjustments people made when they realized their existing map didn't cover the territory in front of them. Then Hagrid said, very quietly, "Who are ye, Harry? It was the right question. Harry had been waiting to see if anyone would ask it for 10 years. Someone who's been here before, Harry said. That's the most honest short answer I have. Hagrid absorbed this. Before, he repeated. Long before, Harry said. Long before Hogwarts, before the Ministry, before wizards built their first fire and called it magic. Before the names we use for things were invented. He said it flatly, without drama. I know it sounds like something a 10-year-old made up. No, Hagrid said, slowly, watching him. No, it don't sound like that at all. It was in that moment that Vernon decided he had had enough. He had been gathering himself in the background this whole time. Harry could feel it, the slow accumulation of indignation and red-faced certainty and the desperation of a man who had spent 10 years managing his fear of the boy in his house by pretending he wasn't afraid. Vernon reached his limit and crossed it simultaneously, surging forward with the energy of a man who has finally decided that the monster under the bed is something he can fight if he gets there fast enough. He grabbed Harry's arm. The room went quiet. Not dramatically quiet, not some imposed silence, not a magical effect, nothing theatrical. It went quiet the way a room goes quiet when something happens that changes the available space for other things. Petunia made a small, cut-off sound. Dudley, still on the floor, pressed back against the wall. Hagrid went completely still on the couch. Harry turned his head and looked at Vernon. Vernon Dursley was a large man, not as large as Hagrid, but large in the ordinary, blunt human way, with the bulk of someone who had eaten well and exercised authority as a substitute for exercise. He was a man accustomed to the effect his size had on situations, to the way a room rearranged itself when he entered it, to the way volume and mass functioned as argument. He had spent most of his adult life as the largest thing in any room he entered. Harry looked at him. It was not a dramatic look. There was no change in the light, no gathering of shadows, no flare of power or visible display of anything. Harry's face remained perfectly calm, perfectly still, the way a very deep lake is still, not because nothing is happening, but because what is happening is so far below the surface that the surface never shows it. But his eyes changed. Not in color. Not in shape. In depth. The green of them went from whatever ordinary green they managed in normal moments to something else, something that had layers to it, like looking down into water that has no bottom, like looking at a sky that has no ceiling, green shading into black shading into a darkness that was not the absence of light but the presence of something that had existed before light was a concept. Ancient. Patient. Absolute. The eyes of something that had watched epochs end and had found the experience mildly instructive. The eyes of something that did not have a name in any human language, but which the nearest available word described as primordial. Vernon Dursley looked into those eyes and his grip opened. Not slowly. Not dramatically. It simply opened, the fingers spreading apart, the hand falling away, as though the command to hold had been quietly, completely rescinded somewhere below the level of conscious decision. Vernon stepped back. Then another step. Then his legs found the wall and he sat down against it the way a building settles when the foundations shift, not falling, not collapsing, just becoming closer to the ground. He was hyperventilating slightly. His face had gone from red to a gray-white that was deeply concerning from a cardiovascular standpoint. Harry held his gaze for one more breath. Then he looked away. Let go, he said, quietly, into the room. Past tense now, gentle, not a command but a release. It's over. He looked at Hagrid. Hagrid was looking at him with the specific expression of a person who has just had an instinct vindicated that they weren't sure they'd been right to have. Something in his posture had changed, not retreating, but reorganized, the way a person reorganizes when they understand they were right to be careful about something. He was not afraid. That was what Harry noticed first and found, with genuine relief, to be true. Hagrid was shaken. Hagrid was recalibrating. But fear, in the deep and running sense, was not what was in his face. What was in his face was a kind of honest, open awe that Harry found far more comfortable to be around than the alternative. "Sorry," Harry said, to him specifically. "That was more than I intended." Hagrid let out a long, unsteady breath. "He grabbed ya." "He did. Can say he didn't deserve whatever that was. He didn't deserve anything, specifically. He was frightened. Frightened people do regrettable things." Harry glanced at Vernon, who was being attended to by Petunia in the hushed, urgent way of someone patching a wall rather than addressing its structural problem. "I've never hurt him. I've never wanted to. I just needed him to remember." "Remember what?" "That I told him not to do that. When I was 3. He paused. "I think the lesson had faded." Hagrid made a sound that was attempting to be serious and not quite managing it. It became a laugh halfway through, the big rolling kind that filled the hut from end to end, warm and genuine and completely out of place in the frozen, shell-shocked room, and somehow the laugh was the most human thing that had happened in the last 5 minutes and the room thawed slightly around it. "Right," Hagrid said, once he'd settled. "Right. Hogwarts. Diagon Alley first, Gringotts, your family vault, school supplies, wand. Professor Dumbledore's also asked me to pick up something from Vault 713, high security," he said. "Don't touch it, don't look at it longer than necessary, just pick it up and bring it to Hogwarts." Harry turned the small brass key over in his fingers. "What is it?" "He didn't say. But you have an idea." Hagrid's large face did something careful and deliberate, in the way of someone who has been specifically told not to speculate and is speculating anyway. "There's been rumors," he said. "About something being moved. For safety." "Moved because something's looking for it," Harry said. Hagrid looked at him. "Ya don't miss much, do ya?" "Not generally." "The vault," Hagrid said firmly, in the voice of someone establishing a conversational boundary. "We'll deal with the vault when we get there." Harry let it go. He had enough from the shapes of the pauses, from the weight of what Hagrid hadn't said, from the specific quality of Dumbledore choosing this particular moment, this particular year, the year Harry came to Hogwarts, to move something to safety. He had enough to be going on with. He picked up his bag from the floor of the small room. Paused in the doorway to look back at the Dursleys, Vernon sitting against the wall with the look of a fundamentally reconfigured man, Dudley pressed into his corner, Petunia kneeling next to Vernon with her hand on his arm and her face doing the exhausting work of holding everything still. "I'll be back for the summer," Harry said to Petunia. Not harshly. Just informatively. "I'd prefer the small bedroom. The window faces the garden, which I like. The cupboard was suitable when I was smaller, but I've outgrown it." Petunia looked at him. Her eyes were the pale blue of winter sky, and in them Harry could see the architecture of a life spent managing something she didn't understand by building walls around it, and the specific look of someone watching all those walls come down at once. "Yes," she said. Her voice was very controlled. "Of course." "Thank you," Harry said. "There won't be any trouble from me. There never has been." He looked at her for one more moment, and something passed between them that wasn't kindness exactly but was adjacent to it, a recognition of the thing she'd carried, the fear and the strangeness and the daily work of normalizing the deeply abnormal. He didn't forgive her for the cupboard. He didn't condemn her either. He simply saw her, and she felt it, and she looked away. Harry went out of the hut into the last of the storm. The rain had thinned to something more like heavy mist. The sea was still working itself up about something, the waves were large and purposeful and full of the North Atlantic specific cold conviction, but the lightning had moved inland and the thunder was growing distant, the storm walking away. The sky to the east had a quality to it that was not quite light but was the precondition for light, the membrane between dark and dawn just beginning to show some tension. Hagrid came out behind him and stood for a moment looking at the sea with the expression of someone who has found their evening considerably more complicated than anticipated and is deciding whether this is good or bad. "You all right?" he said to Harry. "Yes," Harry said. "Are you?" Hagrid considered this with unusual seriousness. "I've seen a lot of things in my life," he said eventually. "Things that'd make a grown wizard drop his wand and sit down. I worked with magical creatures since I was young, dragons, hippogriffs, things with names most people can pronounce. I know what power looks like." He paused. "But what happened in there, that wasn't magic. Not like I've ever seen magic. That was something else. Something older." "Yes," Harry said again. Hagrid turned to look at him, and his expression in the pre-dawn dark was careful and genuine and honest. "Should I be scared of ya, Harry?" Harry looked back at him, and the green of his eyes was ordinary and readable in the half-dark, just a boy's eyes. "No," he said. "You specifically?" "No. Not ever." Hagrid held his gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded, with the slow certainty of a man whose instincts he had learned over decades to trust. "Right," he said. "Good." He reached into his coat and produced the motorcycle from somewhere it definitely hadn't been, with the matter-of-fact ease of someone for whom impossible storage was a daily practicality. The bike was large and black and old and looked like it had opinions about where it was going, the engine ticking in the cold air. The sidecar was battered and had no discernible seatbelt situation. "Buckle up," Hagrid said, swinging his massive leg over the seat. Harry examined the sidecar with academic thoroughness. "Does it have one?" "More of a figure of speech," Hagrid admitted. Harry got in anyway, settling his bag between his feet, and looked out at the grey sea and the grey sky and the gathering promise of the eastern horizon, where the sun was beginning to think about what it was going to do. The engine turned over with a sound like a very large animal deciding to cooperate. The bike shook itself awake, seemed to consider its position, and then rose. Harry gripped the side of the sidecar and watched the rock and the hut and the North Sea drop away below them, growing small and ordinary as altitude converted them back into landscape. England spread out in the pre-dawn distance, green and dark and full of its particular ancient, pragmatic beauty, hedgerows and stone walls and the silver threading of rivers that had been running in the same bed since the last ice age. He felt the wind against his face, cold and clean and smelling of salt and distance, and felt something in him open that had been closed since before he could remember, a sense of beginning, of things in motion that had been still, of a story recommencing after a very long interval. The world below him was ancient and strange and full of people who had no idea what was awake and moving through it. He thought, with genuine warmth, that they were about to find out. The bike banked east, into the rising light, and Harry watched the horizon like he was reading the first page of something he already knew was going to be excellent. Chapter 2, Diagon Alley and the smell of greed. They came down out of the clouds over London at 6:30 in the morning, when the city was still doing the slow, grumbling work of becoming itself, delivery vans on the arterials, pigeons reorganizing on ledges, the Thames catching the early light and throwing it back in flat silver. Hagrid brought the motorcycle down through a gap in the cloud cover with the casual precision of someone who had done this particular commute many times and had strong opinions about the best approach vector. Harry watched London assemble itself below him and felt the city's age the way he felt all old things, as a texture, a depth, layers of time compressed into the geography of streets and buildings and the particular weight of a place where enormous numbers of humans had lived and died and built things that outlasted them. London was not old by his reckoning, not remotely, but it was old by human standards and it knew it, and there was something in that accumulated self-awareness he found comfortable. They landed in a back street near Charing Cross Road, the motorcycle folding itself back into Hagrid's coat with a resigned shuddering that Harry found endearing. It was barely 7 in the morning. The street was empty except for a ginger cat sitting on a dustbin who looked at Harry with the specific cat expression that conveyed awareness of something the observer would prefer not discussed. Harry looked back at it for a moment. The cat left. "Leaky cauldrons just here," Hagrid said, leading the way with the comfortable confidence of a man navigating by landmarks that most people couldn't see. Harry walked beside him and watched the ordinary London street do its ordinary London thing, a newsagent's pulling up its shutter, a man walking a dog that was deeply unhappy about the hour, a bus going past with 3 passengers who all looked like they were conducting separate internal arguments. He almost missed the pub. Not because it was hard to see, but because something about it moved the eye away, a deep, structural suggestion embedded in the stonework and the signage and the general presentation that said this is not interesting, look elsewhere, to the part of the brain that processed visual information before conscious thought could weigh in. It was clever work. Old work, probably, maintained and refreshed over generations until it had the smoothness of long use. Harry looked at it directly and it resolved immediately into an old pub with a leaning sign and small dark windows and an air of long, uncomplicated service. The leaky cauldron was dim inside and smelled of ale and candle wax and a quality of time that was difficult to name, not exactly mustiness, more the smell of a place that had been doing the same things in the same way for so long that the pattern had soaked into the walls. A barman materialized from the dimness the way barmen always do, with the unhurried permanence of a piece of furniture, and said, "Hagrid," with genuine warmth. Then his eyes moved to Harry. Tom the barman had seen, Harry suspected, a very great deal in his years behind that bar. He had the face of a man who had watched history walk through his front door often enough to recognize the gate. But whatever he had been expecting to see next to Hagrid, some confused, overwhelmed 11-year-old, probably, some wide-eyed child encountering the magical world for the first time, what he got was Harry looking back at him with the calm, cataloging attention of someone conducting a leisurely survey of their new environment. Tom blinked. Then he straightened up. It was involuntary, Harry thought, the same reflex that makes people sit up straighter when something they'd been waiting for finally arrives, some combination of recognition and response that happened below conscious decision. "Mr. Potter," he said. And then he did something Harry had not anticipated, he took off his hat. Harry accepted this with the same gravity it was offered. "Good morning." Within approximately 90 seconds of that exchange, the leaky cauldron had become a different kind of place. People materialized out of corners and back rooms and upstairs, not running, not making a scene, but moving with the purposeful casualness of people who have just realized something significant is happening and want to be near it without appearing to be crowding it. Hands were extended. Names were offered. A witch in her 50s burst into tears. 2 wizards knocked their chairs back simultaneously and stood without apparently deciding to. Harry shook hands, said good morning, accepted the tears as unavoidable, and did not step back from any of it. He had waited 10 years for this specific moment and was not going to be flustered by it now. But he also didn't perform warmth he wasn't feeling, he was simply present, attentive, and honest, which turned out to be more than sufficient. What he noticed, underneath all of it, was the quality of it. These people were not meeting a celebrity. Or not only that. They were meeting something that had been promised, the ending of something terrible, the guarantee of a morning without fear, and the gratitude in them was real and specific and had nothing to do with fame. It was survival gratitude. It was the gratitude of people who had been afraid in the dark and then the lights had come back on. He found it, genuinely, moving. Hagrid extracted them before it became an event, steering Harry through the pub's back courtyard with practiced efficiency and tapping the correct brick in the back wall, 3rd row, 2nd from the left, with his umbrella. The wall opened. Diagon Alley came through in a wave. Sound first, the layered ambient noise of a marketplace that had been running continuously for centuries, voices and cobblestones and the occasional owl and the sharp chemical smell of potion ingredients drifting from an open shop door. Then color, all of it, shop signs in every shade, robes in purple and green and deep red, the shop windows full of objects that moved and gleamed and occasionally objected to being looked at. Then the sheer density of it, the way the alley packed more per square meter than any ordinary street managed, everything compressed and immediate and full of its own energy. Harry stood in the entrance to the alley and let it all arrive. Most first-timers, he suspected, were overwhelmed. The scale of it, the strangeness, the sudden total immersion in a world that operated by different rules. He understood why. The disorientation was real. There was a lot happening simultaneously in a relatively small space, and the magic bleeding off every surface and object and person had its own cumulative texture, a warmth and a weight that built quickly. Harry found it, mostly, small. Not dismissively small. Not unimpressively small. Small in the way a music box is small, intricate, delightful, full of genuine craft and genuine charm, but contained. He could feel the limits of it, the edges, the place where the magical world stopped and the ordinary one continued, and the magical world, this one, this human-built, relatively recent construction of wands and potions and enchantments and tradition, was young. It was centuries old at most. It was a child playing with fire and finding it wondrous, not yet knowing that fire was not the deepest thing. He walked into it with genuine pleasure, which was its own thing. Gringotts first, Hagrid said, pointing toward the white marble building at the far end of the alley, which announced itself with a kind of architectural arrogance that said wealth and security and do not test us in the language of columns and steps and sheer resistant mass. They walked the length of the alley, and Harry looked at everything. Ollivander's with its single wand in the window and its air of age and significance. Flourish and blots with towers of books visible through the glass. The apothecary exhaling its complicated chemical breath. Madame Malkins with robes on mannequins that were arguing with each other about something in the window. Halfway up the alley, a group of older wizards, adults, not students, stopped talking as Harry passed. One of them said something to another, very quietly, and Harry caught the tone rather than the words. It wasn't awe, this time. It was uncertainty. The kind of uncertainty that comes from conflicting signals. Here is the boy who should be safe and ordinary and manageable, and here is what he actually feels like, and those two things are not reconciling correctly. He filed it away without comment. Gringotts' front steps were wide and white and flanked by goblins who stood in the precise posture of things that are armed and know they're armed and want you to know they know. Harry looked at the nearest one as he came up the steps, a studied look, and the goblin looked back at him. Then something happened that had, he was fairly sure, never happened before. The goblin stepped back. Not retreating. Not fearfully. More the way a very good chess player steps back from a board when they understand, suddenly, the full shape of the game in front of them. A recalibration. The goblin's eyes, amber, sharp, old, moved over Harry with the deliberate focus of appraisal, and in them Harry could read something that was not reverence and was not fear but occupied the territory between them. Then the goblin inclined its head. Not a bow. Goblins did not bow. Harry understood this instinctively and also from everything he'd managed to absorb about goblin culture through books and the peculiar osmosis of existing in England near a magical community for 10 years. But an inclination of the head, a gesture that acknowledged something without specifying what. Recognition of a kind, offered from something old to something older. Harry inclined his head in return. Hagrid, who had been watching this exchange, said nothing. But he walked a little more carefully up the remaining steps, and Harry noticed. The interior of Gringotts was vast and gold and full of goblins doing things with mathematical intensity at desks arranged in long rows, their movements efficient and economical and entirely focused. The chandeliers were extraordinary, not beautiful, not designed for beauty, but functionally excessive, throwing light into every corner with the determination of an organization that trusted shadow significantly less than it trusted gold. They were directed to a counter at the far end, and the goblin who looked up from behind it was older than the ones at the door, older in the way that goblins get older, not wrinkled but condensed, the long years pressing them down into something denser and more concentrated, like wood under enormous weight becoming something harder than wood. He looked at Hagrid. Then he looked at Harry. His name, as far as Harry could read from the nameplate at an angle, was Grip Hook. No, that was further down. This one's plate said Ragnarok, which was a name Harry associated with something he couldn't quite locate but felt he should recognize. Hagrid, the goblin said. His voice was dry and precise, like a well-maintained mechanism. Then, to Harry, with a shift and register that was subtle and complete, Mr. Potter. Good morning, Harry said. The goblin's amber eyes did their slow, deliberate work. They moved from Harry's face to his hands to the scar on his forehead and then back to his face, and the examination was not perfunctory, it was genuinely thorough, the kind of appraisal that took its time because it had specific things it was looking for. Whatever it found, it settled something. The goblin set down his quill. He folded his long-fingered hands on the desk in front of him. "We've been expecting your account to become active," he said. "The Potter family has banked with Gringotts for 11 generations." "I know," Harry said. "I have the key." He produced it. The goblin took it, turned it over once, and set it down without using it. "The key is a formality," he said. "The vault recognizes you regardless." He paused. "There are also several other holdings registered to your family account that your account manager has been maintaining in the interim. You may wish to schedule a full accounting review at your earliest convenience." "I'd like that," Harry said. Hagrid cleared his throat. "There's also something, in Vault 713, Ragnarok, Professor Dumbledore. We are aware of Dumbledore's request," the goblin said, in the tone of someone who does not need to be reminded of their own bank's business. He signaled, and a younger goblin materialized from behind a door and took the key from the desk. "Griphook will take you down. Both items. The Potter vault first." They descended into the earth in a cart that moved with the cheerful disregard for passenger comfort that suggested it had been designed by someone who found the concept of passenger comfort mildly funny. The tunnels went deep and then deeper, the temperature dropping, the stone changing from worked and dressed to raw and ancient, fault lines in the walls that went back to before human memory. Harry felt the depth like a homecoming. The Potter vault was substantial. Gold, galleons in quantities that meant nothing to Harry, who had never had occasion to use money, and various boxes and chests and sealed containers whose contents he noted without opening. On a shelf near the back, a collection of photographs in frames, several boxes of letters, and his parents' wands laid in separate velvet trays. He looked at those for a moment. He would learn later what each wand had been made of, what core, what history. For now he simply registered their presence, 2 objects that had been instruments of 2 lives, laid down and waiting, and felt the weight of it without sentiment, which was not the same as without care. "Take what you need," Hagrid said, from the doorway. Harry filled a pouch with gold he had no particular concept of the value of, picked up one of the sealed letters from the nearest chest on an impulse, and left the vault. Vault 713 was further down and further in. The cart descended through tunnels where the air tasted of deep time, stone that had never been above ground, water that had been moving through the same channel since before London existed above it. The passage grew narrower. The torches, which had been brass-fitted and regular in the upper reaches, became improvised and infrequent. The vault door was different in kind from the Potter vault's door. The Potter vault had a lock. This one had something that was not a lock but a dissuasion, a layering of enchantments that said you do not want what is in here in a low, persistent frequency designed to alter the thinking of anyone who came near it. Not quite a compulsion. More a sustained suggestion. Harry felt it register against his awareness and pass through without catching. Griphook, who had been watching him sidelong the entire descent, watched this happen and said nothing. He touched the vault door with a long finger, and it opened. The object inside was small. A small, dirty, linen-wrapped parcel, roughly the size of a large book, sitting on an otherwise empty shelf with the self-contained significance of something that knew what it was. Harry could feel it from the doorway, not heat, not cold, not the warmth of ordinary magic, but something more like tension, like a bowstring drawn to its limit and held there, patient and tightly coiled. He recognized the quality, if not the object. He had felt it before, in things that had been given enormous amounts of concentrated human intent over long periods, objects that had become more than objects, that had been desired and pursued and protected until the desire and pursuit and protection were as much a part of them as their physical substance. He thought, this is what Voldemort is looking for. He thought, this is why the timing of this year matters. He did not touch it. He watched Hagrid wrap it more securely with several additional layers that were provided by his coat and stow it carefully inside, and he watched Hagrid's face while he did it, the careful concentration, the deliberate not thinking too hard about it that was its own kind of thought, and he assembled the picture from its pieces. Something powerful. Something that could be used to restore what had been nearly destroyed. Something Dumbledore wanted secured, and something someone else wanted to find. In Hogwarts. Under his feet, starting in September. Interesting. On the way back up through the tunnels, Griphook spoke to him. Once, without looking at him, in the quiet way of someone saying a thing they'd been deciding about for the duration of a descent. There is a vault here, Griphook said, that has not been opened in 3,000 years. Registered under a name that none of the current staff can read. Not in any human alphabet. He paused. We've had scholars attempt it. Experts in ancient scripts, in magical linguistics. It remains, unread. Harry looked at the tunnel walls going past. Does the vault door have a carving on it, he said. A serpent eating its own tail, with shadow rather than scales? Griphook was very still for the count of 3. Yes, he said. I'll come back for it, Harry said. When the time is right. Griphook said nothing more. But when they reached the upper halls and Hagrid went ahead toward the main counter, Griphook paused and looked at Harry with those amber eyes that were old even by goblin standards, and what was in them was not fear, not quite. It was the specific expression of something ancient meeting something more ancient, and finding the encounter simultaneously unsettling and correct. We have waited a long time, Griphook said, which was the most oblique thing Harry had heard all morning, and he appreciated it. Everything waits, Harry said. That's what time is for. They left Gringotts in the strengthening morning, London fully awake now, the alley properly busy, and proceeded to do the ordinary work of equipping a first-year Hogwarts student. Madame Malkin's for robes. Harry stood on the fitting platform while Malkin's tape measure worked around him with professional impersonality and was measured for 6 sets of black robes, which seemed to him a great deal of identical clothing but which he understood was the point. A boy on the adjacent platform was also being fitted, blonde, with the posture of someone who had spent enough time being agreed with that disagreement had become a foreign concept. He looked at Harry. Harry looked back. Hogwarts, the blonde boy said. Yes, said Harry. My name's Malfoy, the boy said, with the tone of someone who has been told their name is interesting their whole life. Draco Malfoy. Harry noticed several things simultaneously, the careful deployment of the surname, the assessing quality of the look that accompanied it, and underneath both, the particular anxiety of a boy who had been told what to expect from this encounter and was finding the actuality uncooperative. Draco Malfoy had clearly been briefed about Harry Potter. He was running the briefing against the reality and finding the gap between them wider than anticipated. Harry Potter, Harry said, simply. Malfoy's eyes moved to the scar, moved away, returned. I heard you were at the cauldron this morning, he said. People were talking about it. People were kind, Harry said. Malfoy seemed briefly uncertain whether this was an agreement or a deflection. Do you know what house you'll be in? My family's all been in Slytherin. I don't know yet, Harry said. Houses sort based on character, not preference, as I understand it. Well, yes, Malfoy said, with the tone of someone adjusting the framing of their argument on the fly, but some houses are better than, I think we probably mean different things by better, Harry said, pleasantly. Not dismissively, just matter-of-factly, the way you'd note that two people were using the same word for different things. Malfoy stopped. Looked at him again with that calculating assessment. Something in his face shifted, not hostility, but the specific reconsideration of a person who has been told how a conversation is going to go and has just realized that the other participant has a different script. He was not unintelligent, Harry noted. That was worth noting. You're not what I expected, Malfoy said, which was, Harry thought, the most honest thing he'd said in the whole exchange. People keep saying that, Harry said. Madame Malkin declared him finished. Harry collected his robes, paid from the pouch without looking at the amount because he didn't yet have a strong sense of what any amount meant, and followed Hagrid back out into the alley. Flourish and Blots was a controlled chaos of books, shelves floor to ceiling, multiple floors connected by staircases that rearranged periodically, books that shelved themselves and others that strongly objected to being shelved and had to be held down by the spine. Harry moved through it with a list and without urgency, locating each text and adding 2 or 3 additional ones that caught his attention, a history of magical theory, a slim volume on the theory of magical cores, something called Boundaries of the Known, Unexplained Magical Phenomena, 1200 to 1900, that was in a back corner looking like it had been waiting for someone to notice it for approximately as long as the title suggested. He paid for those separately, because Hagrid was managing the curriculum list and Harry thought that explaining why he wanted a book called Pre-Wand Magic and the Primordial Record was a conversation for another day. The apothecary smelled of sulfur and dried plants and something sharp and chemical that reminded Harry of the deep tunnel air in Gringotts, old and concentrated and full of compressed information. He collected the standard student kit without much ceremony and watched Hagrid argue gently with the shop owner about the price of lacewing flies while thinking about the object in Vault 713. Sorcerer's Stone was the phrase that kept assembling itself from the available pieces, the alchemical tradition, the object's particular quality of concentrated human intent, the specific desire it would represent for someone who had burned away nearly everything that made them a person in the pursuit of immortality. He thought of what remained of Voldemort, scattered, diminished, looking for a body and a way back, and thought about what an object that could restore life would mean to something in that condition. He thought about Dumbledore putting it in the school. He turned this over in his mind the way he turned the black stone over in his fingers, not yet sure if it was a mistake or a plan or both simultaneously. He thought it was probably both. Ollivander's was last. The shop was narrow and tall and full of stacked wand boxes that went up into a dimness that should not have been possible given the building's exterior dimensions. It smelled of sawdust and varnish and something else, something Harry identified after a moment as the collective resonance of several thousand wand cores, each one a small concentrated piece of something magical, packed together so densely the air had a quality to it, the faint hum of accumulated intention. Mr. Ollivander materialized from between the shelves with the specific effect of a man who had been standing very still and had simply chosen to become visible. He was old in the properly worn, well-used sense, like a tree that had been standing for a long time and had stopped worrying about being a tree. His eyes were the pale silver of things that have been polished by long use, and they moved to Harry with an immediacy that suggested they had been waiting. "Mr. Potter," he said. His voice was quiet and exact. "I wondered when I'd be seeing you." "Mr. Ollivander," Harry said. The old man looked at him. Really looked, in the unhurried way of someone who has spent a lifetime understanding objects and had decided to apply that skill to people. The silver eyes moved. Something passed through them, interest first, then deeper interest, then something that sat further down and was harder to name, the expression of a man coming to the edge of the known and looking over. "Your mother," Ollivander said, distantly. "Willow, 10¼ inches, swishy, excellent for charm work. And your father, mahogany, 11 inches, pliable." He paused. "Both wands I made. Both wands I remember." His eyes came back to Harry. "And yours, I have been trying to imagine, for 11 years, what wand would choose Harry Potter. I have been going through my stock in my mind, running through combinations, and I keep arriving at the same unsatisfying conclusion." "Which is?" Harry said. "That whatever chooses you," Ollivander said, "is not in this shop." The silence stretched out, comfortable on Harry's side and charged on Ollivander's. "May I?" Ollivander said, and extended a hand without specifying what he was asking permission for. Harry set his right hand in the old man's palm. Ollivander held it with both of his, not grasping, just contact, his fingertips resting lightly on Harry's palm, and closed his eyes. He was very still. The shop was very still. Even the dust in the air seemed to be waiting. After 30 seconds, Ollivander opened his eyes. "Remarkable," he said, very quietly, to himself. "Wand?" Harry said. "No wand," Ollivander said. "Not possible. The question is not what wand, the question is what core." He let go of Harry's hand and turned back to his shelves, moving with sudden energy, pulling boxes and replacing them, pulling more. A wand works because there is a resonance between the wizard and the magical material, the core creates a channel, a sympathetic alignment, and magic is focused through it. He was moving faster now, his coat stirring. But a channel implies something being channeled. And what you are channeling, Mr. Potter, what is in you, is not the sort of thing a channel handles. It's more like asking a straw to carry the Atlantic. He stopped. Turned back. In his hands was a box Harry hadn't seen him retrieve, older than the others, darker wood, the grain of it going in directions that suggested the tree it had been made from had a complicated relationship with ordinary botany. He set it on the counter and opened it. The wand inside was black. Not dark brown, not near black, black, the absolute black of deep shadow, of the sky between stars, of the inside of a closed fist. It was 11 inches and looked carved rather than shaped, and the wood of it was not any wood Harry could identify, smooth and dense and cold to the eye if not to the touch. "I didn't make this," Ollivander said. "I found it 40 years ago, in a box of very old stock that came with the shop when I inherited it. The wood is unknown. The core is," he stopped. "I have never been able to determine what the core is. Every testing method I have applied has returned either nothing or something that amounts to too much to measure." He looked at Harry. "I have kept it because I understood, without being able to explain why, that it was waiting." Harry looked at the wand. Then he picked it up. The effect was not what happened in the books, no shower of sparks, no warmth, no dramatic light. What happened was quieter and more complete than that. The wand, when Harry's fingers closed around it, stopped feeling like an object and started feeling like an extension, the way your arm feels like an extension, simply part of the system, integrated, not added. There was no resistance, no search for resonance, no the wand chooses the wizard ceremony of adjustment and acceptance. It was just immediately correct. Harry held it, turned it once, and set it back down on the counter. Ollivander was watching him with those silver eyes. "Well," he said. "It's mine," Harry said. "But I won't use it the way most people use wands." "I suspected as much." Ollivander wrapped it with care that exceeded his handling of any other item Harry had seen him touch. "A wand focuses magic for those who need it focused. You don't need it focused. You need something to communicate through, perhaps. A translation device." "That's a better description than most I've heard," Harry said. Ollivander looked at him with those pale eyes, and what was in them was, Harry thought, the cleanest response he had encountered all day, not fear, not awe, not the social recalculation of someone trying to place him in an existing hierarchy. It was pure, uncut curiosity, the kind that had nothing to do with status or safety and everything to do with the pleasure of encountering a genuine mystery. "I've sold wands for 83 years, Ollivander said. Every wand that has done great things, terrible things, ordinary things. I have touched the wand that cast the killing curse on your parents." He paused. "I'm going to say something impolite." "Please," Harry said. "Whoever it is in Hogwarts this year who thinks they're waiting for you," Ollivander said, "they are going to be surprised." Harry paid for the wand and walked out into the alley with it tucked inside his jacket, against his ribs, and the afternoon sun coming down the length of Diagon Alley in long golden strips. Hagrid found him outside, holding 2 ice creams and looking relieved that something normal was available to do. He handed one to Harry with the expression of a man who had eaten 1 ice cream for every significant event in his life and found the pattern worth continuing. Harry ate his ice cream and watched the alley move around him, wizards and witches and their children, owls and cats and the occasional creature that didn't have a simple name, all of it going about the business of the ordinary afternoon with the self-contained energy of a world that considered itself complete. He thought about the vault below. The unnamed vault with the carved door. The vault that had been closed for 3,000 years and that Gringotts had catalogued under an alphabet no one living could read. He thought about the parcel in Hagrid's coat, wrapped in multiple layers, waiting with the patience of something that had already waited a very long time. He thought about Hogwarts, stone and history and 1,000 children and the man who ran it, who had a plan that Harry was fairly certain he was a central piece of and had not been consulted about. He thought about the year ahead with something that was not anticipation, exactly, but was its cousin, the quality of attention you give to something that is about to become interesting. all right?" Hagrid said, next to him, working through his ice cream with the focused satisfaction of a large creature engaged with something it approves of. "Yes," Harry said. He looked up the length of the alley, at the white face of Gringotts at the far end, solid and certain and older than most things here. Then he looked at the ordinary moving crowd, the ordinary afternoon, the world that had no idea what had come to it. "I think it's going to be a good year." Hagrid laughed his rolling laugh. "Yeah," he said, sounding like he'd surprised himself by meaning it. "Yeah, I think it might be." Chapter 3, The Sorting speaks. Once the 1st of September arrived the way important days tend to arrive, without fanfare, pretending to be ordinary, the morning light through the small bedroom window at number 4 doing nothing to suggest that anything was different about this particular Tuesday. Harry had been awake since before the light came, sitting on the edge of the bed with the black stone in his palm, thinking about nothing specific and everything general in the way that very long lives make habitual. The small bedroom was better than the cupboard. Harry had not said this to Petunia, because stating the obvious was a habit he tried to keep in check, but he'd noted it with genuine appreciation the first night, a window that faced the garden, a ceiling high enough to stand under, the particular quality of a space that had been built for a person rather than storage. He'd kept it spare. A few books on the windowsill, the photograph of his parents on the chest of drawers, the stone on the bedside table at night. He'd spent the summer reading everything in the required curriculum twice, and then the additional books from Flourish and Blots in a different order than he'd bought them, working through the history of magical theory with the methodical pleasure of someone tracing a river back to its source. The wizarding world had built something genuinely impressive. He wanted to be accurate about that. Working from first principles, with no prior model to reference, a few thousand years of human magical practitioners had developed a coherent, functional system of extraordinary sophistication. Wands and potions and charms and transfiguration, each discipline a different way of asking matter and energy to do things they wouldn't do without encouragement. It was elegant work. Small scale by his reckoning, but elegant. He'd also spent time in Petunia's garden, which had improved considerably under his quiet attention. The roses had opinions about pruning that Petunia's approach had been overriding for years, and Harry had let them express those opinions, and the garden in August had been something that made people slow down walking past the front of number 4. Petunia had come out one morning to find her garden doing things she hadn't asked it to do and had stood there for a long moment before going back inside without comment. Vernon left for work every morning at 8 and came back at 6 and occupied the middle hours of the day in the way of a man maintaining a polite armed standoff, present, cautious, making no aggressive moves and expecting none in return. Dudley had gone to stay with a friend for most of August, which had suited everyone. On the 31st of August, Harry had packed his trunk. It was an old trunk, black leather, brass fittings, his name painted on the top in the white lettering that the magical supply shop had applied while they waited. He packed the school things with precision and the personal things with less, fitting everything into less space than the trunk required because he'd always traveled light and saw no reason to change. He left the photograph out last, packing it at the top, face up, where he'd see it first when he opened the lid. Now it was 5 in the morning and London was dark outside the window and the car he'd arranged, not through any magical means, just the yellow pages and money from the Gringotts pouch, which Petunia had found so startling she'd lost the thread of her objection entirely, was coming at 6. Harry dressed in ordinary clothes, because he'd be changing on the train, and went downstairs. Petunia was already in the kitchen. She was standing at the counter with her back to him, in her dressing gown, waiting for the kettle. He'd noticed she often came down early lately, whether because she couldn't sleep or because she preferred these quiet morning hours before the day organized itself around everyone's needs, he wasn't sure. Probably both. He sat at the table without announcing himself. She heard him anyway. He'd given up trying to move silently in this kitchen after the second week, not because he couldn't but because it seemed to alarm her more than the ordinary sound of him, and didn't turn around. "Tea?" she said. "Please." She made 2 cups. Set his in front of him and sat across the table with hers, and they sat in the kitchen in the early dark and drank tea and neither of them said anything for a while. Harry had come to find these mornings, the ones where they shared the kitchen in silence, surprisingly comfortable. Petunia managed him best when there was a task to perform, the tea, the making of it, the cups to hold, because tasks gave her somewhere to put her hands and her attention and kept the larger question at a manageable distance. "Train's at 11, he said. "I know." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "I found something, last month. In the attic." She paused in the specific way of someone choosing whether to continue. "Lily's things. From before." There was a box. Harry waited. "There were letters," Petunia said. "From when she was at school. From her first year." She looked into her cup. She wrote about everything. The food, the classes, her friends. The way the staircases moved. Her voice was doing something controlled and careful. She was so happy. Harry felt the texture of this, the specific complicated grief of someone who had loved a person they'd also spent years resenting, the way those two things existed simultaneously without resolution. "She would have liked to know you were going," Petunia said, which was perhaps the most honest thing she had ever said to him directly. "Yes," Harry said. "I think she would have." They finished their tea. Harry washed both cups. Petunia went upstairs to get ready, and Harry stood in the kitchen for a moment and looked at the garden through the window, the roses she hadn't asked for, the roses that had done what they wanted with the summer and produced something unexpectedly lovely. Then he went and got his trunk. King's Cross at 10:30 was organized chaos. The ordinary human version of organized chaos, the particular flavor found in large train stations on the first day of September, families and luggage and the overlapping noise of dozens of separate urgent conversations, announcements over the PA, pigeons that had made themselves at home in the rafters conducting their own indifferent business overhead. Harry navigated through it with his trunk on a trolley and found platforms 9 and 10 without any difficulty, and stood between them for a moment and felt for the ward. It was there, a dimensional fold, cleverly maintained, the kind of sustained enchantment that had been running so long it had settled into the fabric of the building without disturbing it. The barrier between platforms 9 and 10 was the most prosaic possible door, a brick column with a litter bin attached to it, entirely uninteresting, designed to be ignored. Harry walked through it at a steady pace and emerged onto platform 9 3/4, and the Hogwarts Express was there, brilliant red and steaming in the morning light, and for a moment he simply stopped and looked at it. He had not expected to feel anything particular about the train. It was a train. He had seen things that were older and stranger and more significant by orders of magnitude. But there was something about the sight of it that caught him, something human in the response, the sheer occasion of it, the children with their trunks and their owls and their obvious barely contained excitement, the parents holding on a moment longer than necessary, the steam rising into the station's trapped air. He felt, briefly and without embarrassment, glad to be here. He loaded his trunk and walked the length of the train looking for a compartment that wasn't full, which took some time because the platform was busy and children moved in the particular unpredictable way of children, changing direction, doubling back, stopping suddenly to address some crisis that had just occurred to them. He moved through all of it easily, stepping aside before people arrived in his path, adjusting without thinking. He found a compartment near the back of the train that was empty except for a girl with a great deal of bushy brown hair who was sitting very straight with a book open on her lap and an expression of someone who has found a good seat and is quietly determined to keep it. She looked up when he slid the door open. "Is there room?" Harry said. She gave him the quick, comprehensive look of someone who evaluates things efficiently. "Yes, of course," she said. Then, with the slight increase in energy that comes from something recognized, "You're Harry Potter." "I am," Harry said, swinging his bag up to the rack. "You are Hermione Granger," said with a certain emphasis that suggested she'd been working on deserving the name for some time. "I've read about you. Well, in A History of Modern Magic, which covers the events of 1981 in Chapter 41, though the account is fairly brief and doesn't include much detail about the actual. What else have you read?" Harry said, sitting down opposite her. She blinked. "What else?" Beyond the curriculum. You've clearly read the curriculum, you have that look. But you started with history, so I'm curious what else. Hermione Granger had not, from her expression, expected her reading habits to be the second topic of conversation. She recalibrated quickly. Magical Theory by Adelbert Waffling. The Standard Book of Spells, all 7 grades, not just first year. Hogwarts, a history, which is excellent if you skip the first 2 chapters, they're mostly redundant. The Beginner's Guide to Transfiguration, though I'd dispute some of the theoretical framing in chapter 4, what would you substitute? Harry said. She told him. By the time the train left the station, they had covered transfiguration theory, the historical development of the sorting ceremony, the structural differences between charm and enchantment, and the question of whether the Hogwarts Library's restricted section had a coherent organizational system or was organized purely by danger level. Harry found her excellent company, not because she agreed with him, which she frequently didn't, but because she disagreed with arguments rather than impressions, and when she was wrong she adjusted without ceremony, and when she was right she didn't need to perform it. Halfway through the journey a round-faced boy knocked on their compartment door and asked, very apologetically, if they'd seen a toad. His name was Neville Longbottom. He had a toad named Trevor and the expression of someone who had been having a complicated morning and was working very hard not to show how much it was affecting him. He was soft-spoken and careful and had the particular quality of someone who had spent so long being told they weren't quite sufficient that they'd started organizing their personality around the assumption. Harry looked at him with genuine attention. "Come in," he said. "I haven't seen a toad, but I'll help you look if you want company." Neville looked briefly and completely surprised, in the way of someone who had not expected that offer from that particular person. Then he came in and sat down, and Trevor was eventually located in the gap between the seat and the wall, and Neville tucked him into his pocket with the relief of someone whose morning has just improved, and he sat and talked to them for the remaining hour of the journey. He told them, in pieces and without drawing attention to it as significant, about his family, grandmother, mostly, and the specific pressure of being the last of a line and the weight of what people expected that to mean. He mentioned his parents in passing, once, and moved past it so quickly that Harry thought most people probably let him move past it. Harry said, "Augusta Longbottom is your grandmother." Neville blinked. "Yes. She testified at the trials after the war," Harry said. "3 of them. She pushed for the conviction of Bartemius Crouch Jr. when the prosecutorial case was insufficient." He met Neville's eyes. That required courage. Neville went very still. "I didn't know you knew about, I read everything I could find," Harry said. "About the war. About what happened." He paused. "About your parents." Something crossed Neville's face that was too complicated to name. He looked down at Trevor in his pocket and was quiet for a moment. "Gran doesn't talk about it much," he said. "No," Harry said. "I expect she grieves in private. Most strong people do." Hermione was watching this exchange with her book held still in her hands and her very sharp eyes doing the same work they always did, tracking, cataloging, storing. Harry caught her looking and she didn't look away, which he respected. The countryside outside had gone from the suburban geometry of the south to the wider, older landscape of the north, the hills larger and less managed, the sky bigger, and then to the proper darkness of Scotland, late afternoon, the sky purple and grey, hills that took the light and kept it. When the Highlands came into view outside the window they arrived with the quiet authority of something that had been there since before anyone had opinions about landscape. Harry looked at them and felt them look back, which was not a metaphor. They changed into robes in the compartments and tumbled off the train into the dark and the smell of autumn, cold air, distant water, pine somewhere in the wind. First-year students were called away from the main crowd by a voice Harry recognized before he turned to look. Hagrid was there with a lantern the size of a small child, his voice carrying over the noise of 100 students and the wind off the lake with the comfortable authority of someone who had done this every year for decades and had no anxiety about it. He spotted Harry from across the crowd, their eyes met, and Hagrid's face did something warm and complicated simultaneously, the expression of a man reconciling what he knew with what he felt. Harry raised one hand, briefly. Hagrid's mouth did something that was almost a smile and slightly more than that. They took the boats across the lake in the dark, 4 to a boat, the water black and very still and reflecting the castle in the distance, lights in the towers, the shape of it massive against the darker sky, old in the way that mattered. Harry sat in the prow of his boat and looked at Hogwarts coming closer and felt the castle's age reaching toward him the way he'd felt the stone in Gringotts reach toward him, layers of accumulated magic and time and human habitation compressed into architecture. The castle had presence. Not the presence of living things, that was different, warmer, more immediate. This was the presence of something that had been very important for a very long time and had absorbed that importance into its walls. Like a bell that has been struck so many times the metal remembers the sound. Hermione, in the boat beside him, was looking at it with visible emotion that she was clearly trying to keep at a reasonable academic distance and failing. "It's extraordinary," she said, quietly. "Yes," Harry said. "It is." The great hall arrived through massive doors and the sound of 1,000 conversations and the smell of torchlight and old wood and something warm and food adjacent that hit some deep animal comfort register. Harry walked in at the back of the first-year group and looked up at the enchanted ceiling, the night sky above Scotland, clear and full of stars, reproduced with enough fidelity that he could read the constellations, and then down the length of the hall, past the 4 long house tables and up to the staff table on the dais. He found Dumbledore first. The man was immediately identifiable, the long silver beard, the half-moon spectacles, the robes of deep blue with something celestial in the pattern. He was watching the first years file in with the expression of a man who found this particular annual ritual genuinely enjoyable, the particular pleasure of beginnings. His eyes moved along the small procession of nervous children with warm attention. Then they found Harry. Harry had been expecting the moment. He'd been curious about it in the way he was curious about most things, not anxious, not performatively disinterested, just genuinely curious about what Albus Dumbledore, who was by any reasonable assessment the most capable magical practitioner alive, would register when he looked at Harry Potter for the first time. What happened was this: Dumbledore's gaze traveled along the line of first years, found Harry, and stopped. Not paused. Not hesitated. Stopped. His face didn't change, he was too controlled for that, too practiced in the management of visible response. But the eyes behind the half-moon glasses underwent something, a rapid internal adjustment, the specific expression of a very intelligent person encountering something that doesn't fit their existing model and needing a moment to decide whether to update the model or dispute the data. His hand, which had been resting on the table, went very still. Harry met his eyes across the great hall and held them, calmly, without challenge or performance. Just present, just open, just here. Dumbledore held Harry's gaze for approximately 3 seconds. Then he looked away first. Harry filed that away without comment and looked at the rest of the staff table. McGonagall, stern and precise, watching the students with the organized attention of a woman running several processes simultaneously. Quirrell, small, nervous, a turban on his head that Harry registered immediately as wrong in some way he couldn't yet specify, a doubled quality to the man, as though there were 2 things occupying the same space. He noted it and moved on. And Snape. Severus Snape was looking at him. Not the way Dumbledore had looked at him, not with disrupted expectation, not with the frozen frame of a model failing to load. Snape was looking at him with the narrow, assessing attention of someone who has already suspected something and is now examining the evidence. His eyes were black and specific and did not move away when Harry's gaze reached them, which most people's did. He was the second person in the room who didn't flinch at the direct return of Harry's attention. The first had been Dumbledore. The second was Snape. Harry found this, obscurely, more interesting than most of what had happened today. Snape's expression gave nothing away. But his eyes were working, and Harry could read the work in them even if he couldn't read the conclusions, and the work was thorough and unconvinced of its own assumptions in the way of someone who has not yet decided what they think. Harry looked at him for a moment, then looked away. McGonagall brought the sorting hat out on a stool, and the hat, after a moment of sitting there in the silence of a hall full of expectant children, opened its brim and sang. Harry listened to the song with the general interest he gave to anything that contained historical information, which the song did, a précis of the founders and their intentions and the logic of the sorting system that was reasonably accurate as far as he could tell, if understandably compressed. The hat had a good voice for something that was primarily headwear, and the rhyme scheme was more sophisticated than he'd expected. Names were called in alphabetical order. One by one the nervous first-years put on the hat, and one by one it shouted a house. Hermione was sorted into Gryffindor and sat down at the red and gold table with the expression of someone who had been hoping for this result and was trying very hard not to look as pleased as she was. Neville, after a 2-minute conversation with the hat that seemed to be going somewhere he hadn't expected, went to Gryffindor as well, and sat down with the look of someone who has won something they weren't sure they deserved. Draco Malfoy went to Slytherin before the hat had fully settled on his head, with the satisfaction of a confirmed expectation. Potter, Harry. The hall went quiet differently than it had gone quiet for anyone else. The quiet that descended when Harry's name was called was the quiet of several hundred people who had heard a name their whole lives and were now hearing it attached to a real person, in a real room, for the first time. He felt the quality of it, the weight of all those years of story and legend and myth condensed into this moment, trying to land on the shoulders of a 10-year-old boy. Harry walked to the stool. Sat down. Reached for the hat. The hat pulled away. Not dramatically. Not with visible effort. Just the slight but unmistakable withdrawal of something that has extended toward a thing and reconsidered. Harry's hand was a 1/4 inch from the brim when it happened, and the hat sat on the stool and said nothing, and the hall was very still. Harry looked at the hat. The hat looked back at him. This was, strictly speaking, impossible. It had no eyes, but the quality of its attention was unambiguous. A pause of perhaps 10 seconds. Then the hat spoke, and its voice was different from the voice it had used for the song and the other sortings, deeper, more deliberate, carrying the specific weight of words being chosen carefully. I have been placing students for over 900 years. Another pause. You are not a student. Harry said, quietly enough that only the hat and perhaps the nearest students caught it, no. But I am here to learn. A longer pause. The great hall was so silent Harry could hear the candles. Gryffindor, the hat said. And then, only for Harry, in a register below speech, you are older than this hat, older than this school, older than the magic this school teaches. What you choose to do with what you already know will determine whether this year is remembered or merely survived. Harry stood, set the hat back on its stool, and walked to the Gryffindor table. The applause started a beat later than it should have, one beat of stunned silence, and then the Gryffindor table broke into noise, and then most of the hall, and Hermione was clapping with evident pleasure and Neville was clapping with the careful enthusiasm of someone still forming their opinion. At the staff table, Dumbledore was applauding. But his eyes were on Harry with an expression that had moved past the initial freeze and arrived somewhere more complicated, the expression of a man who has just watched something happen that he is going to be thinking about for a very long time. Harry sat down between Hermione and Neville and helped himself to roast chicken, and the feast began. He ate and listened to the table around him, which was a productive introduction to the social ecosystem of Gryffindor, Percy Weasley explaining something procedural to nobody who was asking, the Weasley twins conducting a conversation in half-sentences that managed to be simultaneously efficient and incomprehensible to anyone outside it, the general warm chaotic energy of a table full of people who were pleased to be where they were. Hermione asked him, in the focused undertone of someone who had been waiting for a conversational opening, the hat pulled back from you. Yes, Harry said. I've never read about that happening. I'd be surprised if it had. She looked at him for a moment. He'd noticed she had a particular way of looking at things she wanted to understand, direct and patient, not aggressive about it, just genuinely waiting for the information to become available. What are you? She said. The question surprised him, not because it was wrong but because most people didn't get there that fast. Neville, on his other side, had gone slightly still, pretending to be interested in his potatoes, which meant he was listening. Something old, Harry said. Something that existed before the magic you've read about in those 7 books. He poured himself pumpkin juice, which was excellent. I'm happy to explain more when we have time and quiet. It's not a short answer. Hermione's expression resolved into something that was part frustration, part genuine pleasure at the existence of a mystery worth solving. Tomorrow morning, she said. Before classes. All right, Harry said. Promise you won't give me a non-answer. I don't give non-answers, Harry said. I give long answers at inconvenient times. There's a difference. She considered this. Fair, she said. Neville said, to his potatoes, can I come too? Of course, Harry said. After the feast, the first years were led to Gryffindor Tower by Percy Weasley, who narrated the moving staircases and the trick steps and the general navigational challenges of Hogwarts with the pride of someone who has memorized the information and found the memorization worthwhile. Harry listened and also listened past it, feeling the castle around him, the deep old magic in the walls, the enchantments layered over centuries by hundreds of practitioners, the castle's own accumulated awareness that was not consciousness and not quite the absence of it either. It was the most complex sustained magical working he'd encountered in this body, and he took a moment to genuinely appreciate it. The fat lady's portrait swung open on the Gryffindor common room, which was warm and red and firelit and smelled of old stone and something sweet and woodsy. Students dispersed. Harry found his dormitory, found his trunk at the foot of his bed, sat on the edge of the mattress in the quiet of the room after the other boys had fallen asleep. He was not tired. He rarely was. Sleep was something he did occasionally and for shorter periods than humans required, and in the dormitory's silence he sat and listened to the castle breathe, the settling of old stone, the sound of water somewhere in the walls, an owl calling from somewhere outside. Then he heard footsteps in the corridor. Not a student, too deliberate, too measured, moving with the unhurried purpose of someone who knew exactly where they were going and wasn't expecting to be questioned about it. Harry tracked the steps as they came along the corridor outside the dormitory and stopped, and the pause was exactly the right length for someone deciding whether to knock. No knock. The footsteps moved away. He knew from their pattern, the uneven rhythm, the slight drag on the left, that they belonged to Quirinus Quirrell. He also knew, from the quality of them, from the specific doubled resonance he'd noticed at dinner, that what was walking the corridor outside first-year Gryffindor at midnight was not entirely, or perhaps not primarily, Quirinus Quirrell. Harry lay back on his bed and looked at the dark ceiling. The thing in Vault 713. The thing wearing Quirrell. The scar on his forehead that still remembered the shape of the spell that had tried and failed to kill him 11 years ago. He thought about Dumbledore's frozen moment in the Great Hall. The man had looked at Harry and stopped, and what had stopped him was the same thing that had made the goblin at Gringotts step back, the same thing that had made the Sorting Hat's voice go deeper, the same thing that made Vernon Dursley sit down and stay sitting. Recognition. Old, animal, below-thought recognition, the kind that didn't need to be taught because it came with the architecture of living things, the recognition of something that was on a different tier of the natural order entirely, something that had been present before the order was established and would be present after it concluded. Dumbledore had recognized it and recovered quickly, which told Harry that the man was considerably more capable than his comfortable grandfather presentation suggested. He'd filed it, assessed it, and begun immediately constructing a revised model, all in the space of the walk from the entrance of the Great Hall to the staff table, and by the time Harry had sat down at dinner Dumbledore had already found the expression of pleasant, warm attention that he wore like a garment chosen for its social utility. Harry respected the capability. He was less certain, yet, about the intentions behind it. The corridor was quiet now. He closed his eyes. Not to sleep, to think, in the deep, wordless way that was more natural to him than the sequential grammar of thought, the way old things think, in patterns rather than sentences, in the shapes of things rather than their labels. The year was going to be interesting. He had said that to Hagrid, in Diagon Alley, over ice cream, and he had meant it in the mild and positive sense. He still meant it. But interesting, he was beginning to understand, was going to require more specific definition than he'd initially applied to it. Interesting like Hermione Granger, who had asked him what are you with no preamble and complete sincerity, and who was going to be, he thought, one of the most formidable people he'd ever met when she had a few more years and a few more hard questions to work with. Interesting like Neville Longbottom, who listened to the things most people said and heard the things most people didn't, and who had his parents' courage in him like a seed waiting for the conditions to be right. Interesting like Dumbledore, who had frozen for 3 seconds and then made it look like nothing, and who was keeping something alive in this school's basement for reasons Harry needed to understand more clearly. And interesting like the thing in the corridor, the layered presence walking Quirrell's legs, pacing the halls of Hogwarts at midnight like it owned them already, like it was reacquainting itself with a space it intended to occupy again. Harry opened his eyes. He looked at the dark ceiling of the Gryffindor dormitory, at the canopy of his 4-poster bed, at the small square of window that showed him a piece of Scottish sky and 3 cold stars. He had not come to Hogwarts to be managed. He had not come to be a piece in someone else's arrangement. He had not come to be the weapon or the sacrifice or the symbol or the strategic asset that several people in this school already considered him in their private calculations. He had come because it was time. Because the argument that had been interrupted 11 years ago was going to be continued, and he intended to be present for it, and he intended to finish it, and he had his own ideas about how. One more thought, before the night ran into morning. The Sorting Hat had said, older than this school, older than the magic this school teaches. And Harry had said, I am here to learn. Both things were true. The age was real, the power was real, the vast impersonal depth of what he was real. But 10 years in a human body had given him something he hadn't had before, the specific texture of human experience, the weight of ordinary days, the understanding of what it meant to be small and cold and hungry and alone, to want something and not have it, to grieve someone you'd never known. He had not expected to care as much as he did. About the garden at Privet Drive. About Hagrid's birthday cake. About the sound of Neville's voice when he moved past the mention of his parents. He had not expected to find, in the body of a 10-year-old boy in a 4-poster bed in a castle in Scotland, something that felt, improbably, honestly, like being in the right place. He pulled the blanket up. Not because he was cold, but because it was the human thing to do. Outside, the Scottish stars continued their ancient business. Chapter 4, What Dwells in the Dark. October arrived in Scotland the way October always arrived in Scotland, without apology, replacing September's last warmth overnight with something grey and serious and committed. The lake went from blue to pewter. The trees on the grounds turned in stages, the beeches going gold first, then the oaks going rust, then the whole hillside above the forest becoming something that looked, in the early morning light, like it was quietly on fire. Harry liked October. He'd been at Hogwarts for 6 weeks and had developed, with the methodical patience that characterized most of what he did, a clear picture of how the place worked, not the official version, which was available in Hogwarts, a history and Percy Weasley's ongoing monologue, but the actual version, the living system of the school as it functioned from day to day. The staff, the students, the corridors that moved and the ones that merely pretended to, the third-floor corridor that was locked and carrying a specific layered resonance he'd identified on the second day as the outermost edge of the protections around Vault 713's transferred contents, the suit of armor on the 5th floor that was haunted and knew it and was embarrassed about it. Classes had been interesting in the way that genuinely good craftsmanship is interesting. He had no need of the magic being taught, could perform any of it without the training it was designed to provide, but the structure of how it was taught, the pedagogy, the accumulated human understanding of how to make magic learnable by people who hadn't been born with it already present in their bones, was worth studying on its own terms. He attended every class and paid genuine attention. Charms was taught by Professor Flitwick, who was small and enthusiastic and technically precise in a way Harry found admirable. Transfiguration was McGonagall, whose teaching method was the specific severity of someone who considered their subject important enough to take seriously. Herbology was in the greenhouses with Professor Sprout, who talked to the plants and didn't care who saw her do it, which Harry respected enormously. And then there was potions. Snape had not come to any conclusions about Harry yet. Harry could tell because the man was still watching him, still doing that narrow-eyed assessment that he performed on everything in his classroom but applied to Harry with a frequency and duration that exceeded professional interest. He had called on Harry 3 times in the first class, the famous opening interrogation, "What would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood?" And Harry had answered all 3 correctly, precisely, and without performance, and Snape had given him 0 points for Gryffindor because, Harry suspected, giving him points would have required committing to an opinion about him that Snape wasn't ready to commit to. Harry didn't mind. He found the ongoing assessment entertaining in the same way he found chess entertaining, the moves being made below the surface of the game, the real question underneath the visible one. The real question Snape was asking was, "What are you?" Which was, Harry reflected, the only interesting question anyone in this school had yet thought to ask. Hermione had asked it on the second morning, as promised, in the corner of the common room before breakfast, with Neville sitting beside her holding Trevor and listening with the focused attention of someone who had decided to pay attention and meant it. Harry had told them both the truth, as plainly as he knew how, not the whole of it, because the whole of it was not a single conversation's work, but enough. He'd told them about Nick's wrath, about what it meant to be a primordial thing, about the night in Godric's Hollow and what had actually happened when the curse hit, about the 11 years of waiting and growing and learning to be a person. Hermione had said nothing for 37 seconds, which was the longest he'd seen her go without speaking about anything. Then she'd said, "I need to verify this independently. Not because I don't believe you, I do, actually, which is in itself alarming, but because I can't work with information I haven't sourced." "I'd be disappointed if you didn't," Harry said. She had, over the following weeks, sourced it. He'd watched her work through the library's history section, through the mythology texts, through 2 books she'd ordered from outside the school's curriculum, and through a correspondence with a researcher at the British Museum who specialized in pre-Celtic folklore, whose response she'd received last Tuesday and read 3 times before folding very carefully and putting in her book bag. She hadn't told him what it said yet. She was still processing. He let her. Neville had reacted differently, not with research but with a kind of quiet, settled acceptance that Harry had found more moving than he'd anticipated. He'd said, when Harry finished, "Okay," and then after a pause, "Does it hurt? Being that. In this?" Gesturing at Harry's general self. "No," Harry said. "Sometimes it's lonely. But not in a way I can't manage." Neville had nodded with the specific gravity of someone who understood loneliness from the inside and didn't need it explained. He'd been Neville since, just Neville, just present, which was its own kind of gift. The morning of the 31st of October started like most mornings, Harry awake before the others, dressed, down to the common room to read by firelight while the rest of Gryffindor Tower slept. He was working through Boundaries of the Known, which had a chapter on pre-wand magical incidents that was sloppy in its methodology but occasionally stumbled onto something worth noting. He made marks in the margins, which Hermione had told him was barbaric, and which he intended to continue. At 6:30 he heard footsteps on the girls' staircase, which was unusual, and Hermione came down in her school robes with her hair doing something complicated and a library book under one arm and the expression of someone who had been awake for a while and thinking hard. She sat down opposite him and put the book on the table between them. It was old, a private publication, not a Hogwarts library book, slim and badly bound, the title in faded gold on the spine reading Echoes of the First Age, Mythology or Memory. By someone called Bertram Fell, published 1923. Harry looked at it, then at her. "You found something," he said. "Chapter 7, she said. 3rd paragraph. He opened it. The text was dense and the typesetting was the confident indifference to readability of an era when printing was expensive and the author assumed you wanted the information badly enough to work for it. Chapter 7 was titled On the Primordial Entities and Their Recorded Re-emergences, and the 3rd paragraph read, "The dragon of the first shadow, Nick's wrath in the oldest records, appears in the mythological traditions of no fewer than 14 pre-literate cultures with a consistency that strains the category of coincidence. Consistent across traditions is the concept of cyclical dormancy, the entity does not die but withdraws, and the conditions of its return are not prophesied but inevitable, tied not to human events but to accumulated pressure in the magical substrate itself. Several traditions hold that the entity's return is preceded by a significant magical rupture, a wound in the fabric of the world that creates the conditions for re-embodiment. Harry read it twice. Then he closed the book. "The killing curse," Hermione said. "On October 31st, 1981. That's your significant magical rupture." "Yes," Harry said. "So Voldemort he didn't accidentally provide the conditions for your rebirth. He specifically provided them." "More specifically than he knew," Harry said. "The curse didn't kill me. It hit something that was already in the process of reintegration and accelerated it, instead. He gave me a body and a birthday and a mythology at the same time." He paused. "I don't think he'd appreciate the irony." Hermione looked at him for a long moment. "I verified the rest," she said. "As much as I could. The things you described about your own capabilities, there's a tradition called the Umbral Legacy in one of the Celtic sources that Fell cites, which describes abilities consistent with what you've told me." She folded her hands on the table. "I believe you. Completely. I wanted you to know that I got there through evidence, not because I'm easily impressed." "I know," Harry said. "That's why it matters." She looked briefly, very briefly, like she might say something personal. Then she said, "There's also something in Chapter 9 that you should read about shadow manifestation in enclosed spaces." She reached over and opened the book to a later page. Harry read it. Then he looked up at the fire. "Today is Halloween," he said. Hermione blinked. "Yes. The 31st of October," Harry said. 10 years exactly since Godric's Hollow. 10 years since the magical rupture that Fell describes." He let that sit for a moment. Things that run on anniversaries tend to run loudest on the significant ones. Hermione was quiet for 3 seconds. "The castle feels different today, doesn't it?" she said. "Not a question." "Since about 2 in the morning," Harry said. "Whatever is in the third-floor corridor is more present than usual. The enchantments around it are under more strain." "And Quirrell?" Harry looked at her. He hadn't told her about Quirrell yet, he'd been waiting until he had more information before introducing something that would, reasonably, alarm her. "What have you noticed about Quirrell?" "He's frightened," she said. "All the time. That stammer, I thought at first it was genuine, but it's inconsistent. It comes and goes depending on who he's speaking to." She paused. "And he smells wrong." "I know that it doesn't sound strange," Harry said. "You're right. He smells wrong because he isn't one thing." She absorbed this with the rapid, economical processing she applied to all new information. "Voldemort. What remains of him? Using Quirrell as accommodation." He watched her face do the work of holding this together. "He's been here since the start of term. Trying to reach the object in the corridor." "The Philosopher's Stone," Hermione said, with the tone of someone who had arrived at a conclusion via 3 days of library research and is moderately annoyed it took that long. At Harry's look, I narrowed it down. The properties of the object being moved, the timing, Dumbledore's involvement, the security level, Nicholas Flamel's stone is the only thing that fits. Harry looked at her for a moment. "Hermione." "Yes. You are going to be extraordinary," he said, with complete sincerity. She went slightly pink and opened her book to Chapter 9. The Halloween feast was, from a purely culinary standpoint, one of the finer achievements of the Hogwarts kitchen. The house elves had outdone themselves, the tables were buried under things that were orange and brown and gold and smelled of autumn and effort, and the great hall was full of floating candles inside carved pumpkins and the kind of warmth that large spaces generate when they're full of people who are, temporarily, purely happy. Harry ate with genuine appreciation, sitting between Hermione and Neville, watching the hall with the comfortable attention of someone who has nowhere else to be. The staff table was doing what it did, McGonagall in conversation with Sprout, Flitwick managing an enormous plateful with the focused satisfaction of a small man confronted with a large opportunity. Dumbledore at the center, holding court in the most pleasant possible sense, his blue robes catching the candle light. Quirrell was the only one not eating. He was at the end of the table, sitting very still, his hands in his lap, the turban slightly more prominent than usual in the candlelight and carrying its doubled resonance like a second heartbeat. He was staring at the table in front of him with the expression of someone in an internal argument who is not winning. Harry watched him for a moment, then looked away. He felt the evening strangeness the way you feel a change in air pressure, not visible, not loud, but present, accumulating. The October anniversary pressing on the magical substrate of the castle, the thing in the corridor straining against its protections, the doubled thing at the end of the staff table reaching the limit of its patience. All of it converging on this particular night with the momentum of a long-established pattern completing itself. He was eating a piece of apple cake when the doors of the great hall banged open. Quirrell came in at a sprint. Which was remarkable in itself. Quirrell had presented, for the entire term, as a man to whom sprinting was an alien concept, a man so generally tentative about existence that the idea of urgency seemed to cause him physical discomfort. He came in at a sprint, crossed the hall at speed, and arrived at the staff table with his hat askew and his voice doing something between a shout and a gasp. "Troll," he said. "In the dungeons." He grabbed the edge of the table. His eyes were very wide. "Thought you ought to know." Then he folded dramatically to the floor in a feint that was so perfectly executed it might have been theatrical, except that the smell that came off him when he fell was the specific sharp smell of genuine terror, the involuntary chemical honesty of a body that is afraid even if the mind running it has other plans. The hall erupted. Dumbledore took control of it with the speed and authority of someone who has been managing institutional emergencies for decades. Prefects were on their feet, house tables organizing into lines, the enormous procedural infrastructure of the school deploying itself with impressive efficiency. McGonagall was already moving. The staff organized like a military unit. Harry stayed in his seat. Hermione had grabbed his arm, not pulling, just the contact of someone processing a threat while holding onto something reliable. Neville was standing, looking toward the door, very still. "It's not in the dungeons," Harry said, quietly. Hermione looked at him sharply. "The troll is in the second-floor girls' bathroom," Harry said. Quirrell told everyone it was in the dungeons because the girls' bathroom is near the stairs that lead to the third floor. He looked at the collapsed figure of Quirrell, which a third-year prefect was prodding with worried concern. He released the troll as a distraction. "A distraction for what?" Neville said. "To give himself, to give the thing in him, time to try the corridor." Harry stood. He was not hurrying. He simply stood and looked toward the door. The troll will wander toward noise. The students who didn't hear the evacuation announcement properly will be in danger. "Parvati," Hermione said, suddenly, with the specific horror of a remembered detail. "Lavender said she wasn't feeling well after dinner, she went to the bathroom on the second floor, go with the evacuation," Harry said to Neville. "Keep people moving, keep them together. You're good at that." Neville nodded once, without argument. Harry looked at Hermione. "You can come or stay," he said. "Your choice." She picked up her wand. They left the great hall as the evacuation was still organizing itself, moving against the flow of students heading toward the dormitories, cutting through a side passage Harry had mapped in the first week. Hermione kept up without difficulty, she moved quickly and quietly and didn't ask questions while they were moving, which he noted approvingly. They heard the troll before they saw it. It was not subtle. Mountain trolls operated at approximately the volume and subtlety of a shed rolling downhill, their footsteps were structural events, their vocalizations were challenges to the nearest load-bearing wall, and the smell of them was the concentrated argument against getting any closer. This one was in the second-floor corridor, having recently destroyed a section of wall by walking into it, and it was now examining the wreckage with the focused confusion of something that had caused a problem and was trying to determine whether the problem was an enemy. Parvati Patil was in the doorway of the girls' bathroom with her back against the door frame, making no sound, having clearly made the excellent tactical decision that remaining completely still was the best available option. She was white-faced and breathing through her nose in the careful controlled way of someone managing extreme fear. Harry and Hermione came around the corner and Hermione made a small involuntary sound at the troll's size, which was considerable, 12 feet of grey-green muscle and deliberate ugliness, wielding a wooden club the size of a young tree with the aimless enthusiasm of something that hits things for the pleasure of hitting things. The troll turned at Hermione's sound. Harry stepped forward. He didn't raise his wand. He didn't cast anything. He simply stepped in front of Hermione and looked at the troll, and the troll looked back at him, and the troll stopped. This was the thing about very large creatures that were also very simple, they operated on direct sensory input, and when the direct sensory input was contradictory, here is something small, but something inside the small thing is telling every instinct I have to be still, they froze, because freezing is what simple systems do when they receive conflicting commands. The troll stood in the corridor with its club raised and its small eyes doing the slow, confused work of an intelligence that had run into something it couldn't categorize. Harry walked toward it. Not fast. Not aggressive. Just walking, the way you walk toward something that you're not afraid of and never were. His eyes held the troll's the whole time, and the troll tracked him, and the troll's club came down slowly until it was hanging by its side, and the troll made a low sound that was not the bellow Harry had heard from the corridor but something softer and more confused, almost plaintive. Harry stopped 2 feet from the troll. The troll was 12 feet tall and weighed something in the vicinity of a ton. It smelled very strongly of things that had decided not to be edible anymore. Its eyes, up close, were a muddy yellowish brown, and in them Harry could see the animal processing of a creature that had encountered something that did not fit into its experiential model of what the world contained. Harry said, "Sit down." He said it the way you say things to animals that you know can hear you, not with command magic, not with a compulsion, just with the direct application of what he was, the specific register that had made Vernon Dursley's hand open, had made the Gringotts goblin step back, had stilled the corridor on Halloween night 10 years ago. Not power as force. Power as simply, fundamentally, being what he was, and letting things that had functioning instincts read it. The troll sat down. Not elegantly. It folded onto the corridor floor with the inevitability of a building deciding to reconsider its position, the impact shaking the walls and sending plaster dust drifting from the ceiling, the club clattering away down the corridor. It sat and looked at Harry from its new position with the same confused attentiveness. "Stay," Harry said. He turned around. Parvati Patil was standing in the bathroom doorway staring at him with an expression that had moved past fear into something that didn't have a clean name. Hermione was 2 steps behind him, her wand still in her hand, looking from Harry to the sitting troll and back again with the specific expression she wore when she was collecting data. "You need to go to your dormitory," Harry said to Parvati, pleasantly. "The evacuation is happening." Parvati went. Hermione did not go. She stood in the corridor with the troll sitting passively behind Harry and said, "You told a troll to sit down." "Yes." It sat down. It did. She looked at the troll. The troll, for its part, seemed content to sit. It was examining its own hand with mild interest. "This is what you mean when you say you don't need to use the wand the way most people use it," she said. "This is a fairly mild version of what I mean," Harry said. "Oh," she said, in a specific tone that meant she was recalibrating again. She did a lot of recalibrating around him, which he appreciated. Most people stopped after the first recalibration and substituted a new fixed model. Hermione just kept revising. "We should go," Harry said. "Quirrell will be at the corridor by now." They went. The third-floor corridor was lit by torches that burned with the specific cold light of enchanted flame, the kind that doesn't flicker the way real fire does. The door at the end was locked, or had been locked, because when Harry rounded the last turn and saw it, the door was slightly ajar, and the resonance of the protections on the other side was ringing with the specific disturbance of something that had been pressed on hard from this direction recently. Quirrell was on his knees in front of the door. He was not alone in the sense that he was never alone, the doubled presence was acute here, the thing inside him fully forward now, the mask of the nervous professor pressed aside by something colder and more deliberate. His hands were pressed flat against the door's frame, and the protections on the other side were responding to what was coming through his hands with the active resistance of enchantments doing exactly what they'd been built to do. Harry watched for a moment from the corridor's shadow. He could feel the shape of the conflict, the thing using Quirrell pressing against the wards holding, the contest going in favor of the wards for now, but the kind of for now that wouldn't last indefinitely. The thing using Quirrell was not powerful in its current state, diminished, confined, working through a body that wasn't designed for what it was being made to do, but it was intelligent, and patient in the long-term way of something that had been waiting for a very long time and had learned to read situations clearly. Harry stepped out of the shadow. "Professor Quirrell," he said. The figure at the door went completely still. The stillness lasted 2 seconds, and then Quirrell stood and turned, and the face that turned toward Harry was not quite Quirrell's anymore, the stammer gone, the nervous fumbling gone, what remained in the eyes something sharp and cold and not at all human in the way that intelligence without warmth is not human. "Harry Potter," it said. Quirrell's voice, but not Quirrell's cadence. "Something else's. I wondered if you would come." "I expected to find you here," Harry said. "It's October 31st. Significant date, this particular year." "For both of us," it said. "Yes," Harry agreed. He walked forward, not fast, not slow, and watched Quirrell's body tighten as he approached and didn't stop. "You've been here all term. Watching, pressing, waiting. That took patience." "I have learned patience," it said, and something in the voice was old and bitter and real, the genuine texture of someone who had suffered and survived by enduring. "I have had little choice but to learn it." "No," Harry said. He stopped 10 feet away. "I know what you want. The stone. A body. Enough life to finish what you started." He looked at Quirrell's face, at the thing behind it. "You can feel it from here, can't you? What's on the other side of that door? After a year without a body, without anything, you can feel the possibility of it." "You know nothing," it said, with a flash of something, and the flash was the most interesting thing yet, not fury, but pain, genuine pain, the ragged edge of someone who has lost everything and is surrounded by the remains. "I know more than you think," Harry said. "I know what it is to exist without a form. To be present without being embodied. To wait for the conditions that make the next step possible." He paused. "I've been doing it for much longer than you." The thing in Quirrell's body looked at him. Really looked, with the full intelligence of something very old that had been making assessments for longer than most things alive. And something changed in the eyes, a shift, a deepening, the specific attention of something that has just heard something it didn't expect. "What are you?" it said. "You've asked the interesting question," Harry said. "More interesting than the stone, I think." "Answer it." "Something that was old before you were a dream in your mother's mind," Harry said, without heat or performance. "Something that watched the first wizards discover fire and thought it was charming. Something that was present when the world was deciding what it was going to be." The silence in the corridor was absolute. Hermione, behind Harry, was not breathing loudly. "You're not afraid of me," it said, and the surprise in it was genuine, and under the surprise was something that was not quite longing but lived in the same neighborhood. "No," Harry said. "I'm not afraid of anything, specifically. But I'm also not your enemy, specifically. You tried to kill me once, the body I inhabit now, the family it came from. That's not something I hold lightly." He looked at Quirrell's face. "But what you are now is not what you were then, and what you want now is not the same as what you'll want once you've had time to think about it." "You don't know what I want," it said. "You want to be real again," Harry said. "You want to be present. You want to exist without the constant erosion of yourself happening around you." He said it plainly, not cruelly, not as a weapon. "That's not ambition. That's desperation. A long pause. The stone, it said. Is there? The stone is there, Harry agreed. And I'm here. And you know, with whatever part of you is still honest with itself, that I could step through that door right now and neither you nor anything Dumbledore built is going to stop me or touch me. Quirrell's hands, hanging at his sides, curled slowly. You're not going to get the stone tonight, Harry said. Not because I'm forbidding you, I'm not interested in forbidding you things, that's someone else's job. But because taking it tonight, like this, through this body, is not the path to what you actually want. And you know that. What path would you propose? It said, with the particular tone of someone who expects contempt and is receiving something different. I don't have one for you, Harry said honestly. That's not my work to do. Your path is your own. I'll tell you this much, the body you're using is already damaged. Using it to fight through those protections will finish it. And then you're back to nothing, only worse, because you'll have failed here and Dumbledore will move the stone and rebuild the protections and your window will have closed. He let that land. That's not a threat. That's just the shape of the situation. The corridor was quiet for a long moment. Then Quirrell took a step back from the door. One step. Then another. The thing behind his eyes receding slightly, the doubled quality of his presence pulling back, folding inward, the cold intelligence wrapping itself in patience again with the specific practiced motion of something that had been doing this for a year and was very good at it. We will speak again, it said. We will, Harry agreed. Quirrell walked past him, and the passage of him was wrong in the specific way that Quirrell's passage had been wrong all term, the cold draft, the sense of two things in one space, the slight electromagnetic disturbance that Harry associated with the incomplete quality of a presence that wasn't fully housed. He walked past Harry without touching him, which was, Harry thought, the thing that would be remarked upon most if anyone were watching. Hermione exhaled. Harry stood in the corridor until he heard Quirrell's footsteps reach the stairs, and then he turned. Hermione was leaning against the wall with her arms folded and her expression doing something complicated. She looked at Harry for a moment. Then she said, You talked to him. Yes. You talked to Voldemort. What remains of him, Harry said. Which is not nothing, but is not what most people imagine either. What's in Quirrell is frightened and diminished and very intelligent and completely alone. He looked at the door, slightly ajar on its protections. Most dangerous things are. You didn't stop him by force, she said, not accusingly, just cataloging. You could have. Yes. But you chose to stop him by making him think. By being honest with him, Harry said. Which is different from being kind to him, before you say it. He tried to kill me. He destroyed Neville's parents. He killed people for years because he was so afraid of death that he let the fear eat everything else. He moved toward the door and pressed it closed, and the protections resonated back into alignment under his hands with the relieved quality of things returning to their proper configuration. None of that is forgiven. It's just, complicated. Hermione looked at him. You don't think he's going to stop? No. I think he's going to try again. He turned from the door. But not tonight. And not through Quirrell, the way things are going. They started back toward Gryffindor Tower, Hermione matching his pace in the corridor, her footsteps precise and quick on the stone. Can I ask you something? She said. Yes. Earlier, the troll. She paused. When you walked toward it. What was that like? From the inside. Harry thought about this with the seriousness the question deserved. Like walking in the rain, he said finally. You know the rain is there. You're aware of it. But you're not the kind of thing that gets wet. She was quiet for a moment. That sounds lonely, she said. Neville said something similar, Harry said. She glanced at him sideways. And you're both right, he said. And it's less lonely than it was 3 months ago. She didn't say anything to that, just walked beside him in the torchlit corridor with her wand still in her hand and her mind clearly still going at full speed, and Harry found the company of her thinking, the warm presence of that rapid, serious, honest intelligence, something that landed in the category of good. They came back to the portrait of the fat lady, who looked at them with the specific expression of a painted woman who has seen a great deal tonight and has opinions. "You missed the excitement," she said. "We made some of our own," Hermione said. The portrait swung open. The common room was full, the evacuation had herded everyone back here, and the room had the post-adrenaline quality of a lot of people who had been frightened and were now mostly just loud about it. Neville was in a chair near the fire with Trevor in his lap, watching the room with steady attention. He looked up when Harry came in. Harry met his eyes and gave him a slight nod. Neville's shoulders dropped about an inch and he nodded back, and went back to watching the room with the quiet competence of someone who had decided to be the person who made sure everyone was all right, and was doing it without being asked, and was very good at it. Harry sat down on the hearth rug, his back against the armchair Hermione dropped into, and looked at the fire. He thought about Quirrell in the corridor, the step back, the measured retreat, the intelligence that had chosen patience over a charge it couldn't win. He thought about the stone behind that door, sitting in its protections, waiting. He thought about Dumbledore and what the man would find tomorrow when he checked the corridor and found the wards intact but slightly rearranged, pressed on from outside and restored, a conversation written in magical evidence that a very intelligent man would spend a long time reading. He thought about the Mirror of Erist. He'd passed it 3 weeks ago, in a 7th-floor room that the castle had let him into without much ceremony. He'd known what the mirror was before he saw his reflection in it, the inscription was famous enough, and he'd prepared himself for what it would show him, which he expected to be a flat, dimensionless version of what he already was. What it had actually shown him, in the glass, had not been power or the absence of power or a grander version of himself. It had shown him a table. A table with food on it and people around it, Hermione with a book and also laughing, Neville growing something in a pot in the background, Hagrid's enormous silhouette in a doorway, someone with red hair who might have been his mother or might have been a woman Harry hadn't met yet. An ordinary table. An ordinary evening. The mirror showed the deepest desire of the heart, and the deepest desire of the heart of a primordial entity that had woken up in a small boy's body on a cold night in Godric's Hollow was, apparently, this. Something that lasted. Something that stayed. Harry looked at the fire, listened to the common room settle around him, felt the castle breathe its old stone breath around them all. Something that stayed. He thought he could work with that. Chapter 5. The language of bones. November came in grey and earnest and stayed that way, and Quidditch came with it. Harry had not planned to try out for the Gryffindor team. The plan, insofar as he had plans, which he did, structured and clear-eyed and several moves ahead of most situations, did not include competitive broomstick flying in the Scottish autumn. But McGonagall had appeared at his elbow during his first week with the specific energy of a woman who has just discovered a natural resource and intends to do something responsible with it, and had said, without much preamble, that she'd heard about what happened with Neville's Remembrall and that she'd like Harry to try out for Seeker. The Remembrall incident had been, frankly, Draco Malfoy's most interesting moment to date. He'd taken it from Neville with the bored entitlement of someone for whom taking things from people had never produced consequences, and Harry had been watching from across the courtyard with no particular intention to intervene. Neville was more capable of managing Malfoy than Malfoy understood, and Harry believed strongly in letting people manage their own situations before stepping in. But then Malfoy had mounted his broomstick and sailed it out over the courtyard, and Neville had gone up after it without a second thought on a school broom that handled like a shopping trolley, and Neville had wobbled and listed and finally grabbed the Remembrall in mid-air before the broom dumped him entirely, and the expression on Neville's face when he landed, not triumph, just a kind of startled, quiet recognition, like he'd done something and surprised himself, had been worth the whole morning. Harry had taken the broom afterward and flown it back to the rack without being asked, passing Malfoy's eyeline on the way, and the look Malfoy had given him had been interesting in its complexity, not hostility, for once, but the specific calculation of someone who is revising an assessment. The Quidditch tryout had taken approximately 4 minutes. Oliver Wood, Gryffindor's captain and most enthusiastic practitioner of the sport Harry had encountered, had released the snitch from 30 feet up, and Harry had caught it from a standing start at ground level before Wood had finished explaining what a snitch was. Wood had been beside himself. He had used the word brilliant 17 times in 10 minutes. Harry had let him. The first match was Gryffindor versus Slytherin on a Saturday in November, and the morning of it was cold and bright and clear, the specific Scottish clarity that followed days of rain, where the light had a quality of recent laundering and the hills stood out against the sky with improbable sharpness. The Gryffindor team assembled in the changing rooms with the specific mix of confidence and terror that characterized Oliver Wood's pre-match speeches, which were strategically detailed and emotionally comprehensive and somewhat longer than necessary. Harry put on his Quidditch robes, deep red, the school crest on the chest, the Seeker's lighter cut, and listened to Wood's speech with partial attention and spent the rest on the particular quality of the morning and the feel of the new broom, a Nimbus 2000 that Wood had practically trembled producing, running his hand along the handle with the easy familiarity of something that fit well. He liked flying. This had been a genuine discovery, not something he'd expected to feel strongly about but something that had arrived fully formed the first time he'd gone up, a clean specific pleasure in the combination of height and speed and the particular freedom of altitude. The world simplified at height. The castle below became a shape rather than a system, the lake a mirror, the forest a texture. And moving through the air at speed, the Nimbus at full pace was something over 100 miles an hour, was the closest thing this body had to the kind of movement that had been natural to the thing he'd been before, the enormous unbound motion of something that didn't require solid ground. He didn't think about the previous form often. It served no purpose to be nostalgic about a shape you couldn't currently inhabit. But flying helped. He walked out onto the pitch behind the rest of the team and felt the crowd's noise arrive as a physical presence, several hundred people creating the particular wave of sound that sporting events produce, compounded by the cold air carrying it sharply. The Slytherin end was silver and green. The Gryffindor end was red and gold. The staff sat in the teacher's box, and Harry found Dumbledore's blue robes at the center without looking for them, and found Snape next to him, and found Quirrell at the far end, small and still and separate. He found Hermione and Neville in the stands, Hermione with a striped scarf she'd knitted herself in the 2 weeks since finding out Quidditch was a sport that required enthusiasm-adjacent equipment, and Neville wearing 2 of them because Hermione had made him one as well, and both of them visible from the air the moment he got up because Hermione stood up and waved immediately with the unself-conscious enthusiasm she brought to most things when she wasn't managing the professional image. Harry raised one hand. The match started. Oliver Wood's strategy involved Harry doing essentially nothing for the first portion of the match except circling high above the play and watching. The theory was sound, the Seeker worked best with altitude and patience, and the chasers needed time to build a point lead before the snitch catch became decisive. Harry understood the theory and applied it, circling the pitch on the Nimbus at about 60 feet and watching the match below him with the genuine interest he brought to any well-executed physical contest. Quidditch was a better game than it appeared from the ground, he decided. From above, the strategy was visible in ways it wasn't from the stands, the flow of possession, the way the chasers moved in relation to each other, the way the keeper read the play. The beaters were interesting, their job was essentially controlled chaos, and there was a particular kind of intelligence required to make productive decisions in a high-speed environment where the productive decision was frequently counterintuitive. He was thinking about this when his broom kicked sideways. Not a gust of wind. Not a mechanical issue. Something deliberate, something acting on the enchantments in the broomstick itself, pressing at the binding charms that kept the flight path stable, introducing an instability that started as a wobble and, if sustained, would compound into something worse. Harry felt it through the broom handle the way you feel vibration through a held object, and recognized it immediately as a targeting jinx, and looked for the source. He found it in the time it took to scan the stands and the teacher's box, Quirrell, at the far end of the box, his lips moving in the tight controlled way of someone performing a sustained incantation, his eyes fixed on the broom. Harry looked at him. The jinx did not intensify while he was looking at its source. It continued, steady and purposeful, the kind of sustained magical pressure that required focus to maintain. Quirrell was fully committed to it, his hands pressed together under his robes, the doubled presence in him fully forward, the cold intelligence applying itself to the single task of unseating Harry from his broom 60 feet above the ground. Harry stabilized the broom with his left hand, not with a counter-jinx, not with a spell, just with the direct application of the same authority he'd applied to the troll and to Quirrell in the corridor. The specific quality of his presence communicated through his touch on the broomstick, the broom's enchantments responding to something that was not magic as Quirrell understood it and therefore not addressable through Quirrell's counter. The broom stopped wobbling. Quirrell's lips kept moving. Harry kept flying, in a long, unhurried circle, watching the match below him. He let Quirrell keep working. Not because he couldn't stop it, he could have ended it from here, could have redirected the jinx, could have done several things that would have stopped the whole situation immediately, but because stopping it dramatically would require explanations he wasn't yet ready to provide, and because Quirrell working this hard on something that wasn't working was, in itself, informative. He learned things about his opponents by watching them try. Below, a Slytherin chaser took a bludger to the shoulder and fumbled possession. Gryffindor recovered. The score was 50-30, Gryffindor ahead. Harry spotted the snitch. It was at ground level, near the Slytherin goalposts, floating in the specific idle oscillation of something that wasn't going anywhere yet. He noted it. Looked back at the play. Let the game develop for another 30 seconds. Then he pointed the nimbus straight down. The dive from 60 feet is not a long dive by Seeker standards, but the nimbus at full power made it very short indeed, and what it lacked in drama it compensated for in commitment. Harry came off the top of his arc and went straight down with the broom running everything it had, the cold air going past at the specific speed where it stops being individual gusts and becomes a single sustained pressure. He was aware, peripherally, of the crowd noise changing register, the uncertain rising quality of a crowd that has seen something start and is waiting to see if it lands. The Slytherin seeker saw him go and banked hard, cutting across the pitch at a lower angle, trying to intercept. He was fast and he was good and he had less distance to cover. Under ordinary circumstances it might have been close. Harry reached the snitch at the same moment his broomstick leveled off 18 inches above the turf, catching it between two fingers without closing his fist, the broom still doing 90, and pulled up into a climbing arc that took him back to 30 feet before the crowd had fully processed what had happened. He opened his hand. The snitch sat in his palm, wings fluttering with the resigned energy of something that knows it's been caught. The crowd made a sound. Then the crowd made the bigger sound, the one that happened when the initial disbelief resolved into certainty, and Lee Jordan's commentary exploded from the commentary box with something that was more a sustained exclamation than a sentence. Harry flew back to the middle of the pitch. Oliver Wood was doing something at the Gryffindor end that involved both fists in the air and a volume of celebration that probably constituted a health concern. The team converged on Harry from several directions, and Harry suffered the enthusiastic physical attention of 6 people who were very happy with him without complaint, because their happiness was genuine and he respected genuine things. In the teacher's box, Quirrell's lips had stopped moving. Harry looked at him, briefly, from the air. Quirrell looked back. Whatever was in Quirrell's expression was not fury, not humiliation, it was, again, the most interesting possible response, which was the specific look of someone reassessing the dimensions of a problem they thought they understood and finding it larger than expected. Harry looked away. After the match, after the changing rooms and Wood's post-match analysis that lasted longer than the match itself and had detailed diagrams, and after Hermione's examination of the nimbus for residual jinx evidence and Neville's question about whether she'd felt the broom going unstable because she didn't want to be the one to say she'd noticed, Harry went to see Dumbledore. He had not been to the headmaster's office before. He'd located it in the 3rd week, identified the gargoyle, catalogued the office's position in the castle's magical architecture. It sat at the confluence of 3 of the castle's strongest structural ley lines, which was either deliberate positioning or very fortunate accident. Harry suspected the former, and filed it for when he needed it. He walked up to the gargoyle and said, "Lemon drop," because he'd heard it from a 6th year in passing, and because using the obvious answer to the obvious question was its own kind of statement. The gargoyle stepped aside. He went up. Dumbledore's office was exactly what it should have been and slightly more, the circular room full of delicate silver instruments and portraits of previous headmasters and the particular organized quality of an intelligent person's working space, where every apparent chaos is actually a system you haven't learned yet. Fawkes was on his perch, a phoenix of extraordinary color and stillness, who looked at Harry as he came in with the specific animal attention of a creature that could perceive what other things couldn't and had made its assessment already. Fawkes chirped once, very softly. Harry looked at him. "Hello," he said, and meant it. Dumbledore was sitting behind his desk with the expression of a man who had been expecting this visit and was simultaneously glad of it and uncertain about it. He gestured at the chair opposite with the warmth he deployed for most interactions, real warmth, Harry had decided, genuine in its way, but also deliberate, a warmth that was honest in its feeling but strategic in its timing and direction. "Harry," he said. "Please sit down. Would you like a lemon drop?" "No, thank you," Harry said, and sat. Dumbledore looked at him over the half-moon spectacles with the searching patience of a man who has a great deal of practice looking at people until they speak. Harry had a great deal more practice being looked at in exactly this way, so they sat for a moment in the comfortable silence of two people who had decided to let the other speak first and were genuinely prepared to wait. Then Harry said, "How long were you watching the broomstick jinx before you let it go on?" Dumbledore's expression shifted by precisely the amount it always shifted, a small, real response before the management came back. "Long enough to determine it wasn't threatening you," he said. "Which told me something. It told you I was either protected by an external charm or managing it myself," Harry said. "It told me that the jinx, which was of considerable power and precision, appeared to be having no effect on you despite going uninterrupted for the first 2 minutes of the match." Dumbledore's eyes were doing their work behind the spectacles. "I then observed that it was continuing not because no one could stop it, but because you had chosen not to stop it. I wanted to know how hard he'd push before he recognized it wasn't working," Harry said. "And what did you learn?" "That he has patience but not unlimited patience. That he's willing to risk the visibility of a public attempt if the alternative is waiting." Harry looked at Dumbledore. "He's running out of time in Quirrell. The body is deteriorating. He knows you'll move the stone after this year. The window is closing." Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had shifted from the warm grandfather to something more careful, more precise. "You are aware of the stone?" "Since Diagon Alley," Harry said. "Since the vault." "And the passenger in Professor Quirrell?" "Since the first night of term." He paused. "You've known I know." "I suspected," Dumbledore said, "since the sorting. Since the moment in the Great Hall." He set down the lemon drop he'd been turning over in his fingers. "I want to ask you something, Harry, and I'd like an honest answer." "I'll give you one," Harry said. Dumbledore looked at him, and what Harry saw in the man's eyes was something he hadn't quite seen clearly before, not the warm calculation, not the strategic warmth, but something underneath both of those, something genuine and uncertain and, Harry thought, quietly afraid. Not afraid of Harry. Afraid of the question. "What are you?" Dumbledore said. Harry held his gaze. "Something that was here before you built this school," he said. "Something that was here before the magic you practice existed in this world. Something that has no stake in your wars, your prophecies, your political arrangements." He let that settle. "But something that has, for reasons that have more to do with this body's history than with any grand design, become involved in your particular situation." "The prophecy," Dumbledore began, "was written about a boy," Harry said, calmly. "A boy who would have the power Voldemort knew not. The prophecy is accurate. I am, currently, that boy. And I have power Voldemort doesn't know. Both things are true. The prophecy implies a destiny. A role. The prophecy implies a conclusion," Harry said. "I intend to provide one. But I'll provide it my way, on my terms, when I decide the time is right." He looked at Dumbledore steadily. "I'm not a piece, Professor. Not on your board or his. I'm aware that you've been building toward an arrangement where I play a specific part, and I want to be clear that I understand the arrangement and have decided not to play it. Dumbledore was very still. I'm not your enemy, Harry said, and meant it fully. I think you're a good man. I think you've done a great deal of good in a world that has needed it badly. I think you're capable of more honesty than you usually employ, and I think the reason you don't employ it more is that you've spent so long managing things that managing has become the reflex even when it isn't necessary. He paused. You don't need to manage me. You just need to work with me. A long silence. Fawkes made a sound on his perch, a low, resonant note, not the full song but a phrase of it, warm and precise. Dumbledore looked at Harry for a long time. Then he said, very quietly, "You are not what I expected." "I've heard that," Harry said. "What I expected," Dumbledore said, "was a boy who had survived a miracle. What I appear to have is something considerably more complicated." He looked at his desk, at the lemon drop sitting on it, picked it up and set it down again. "I will confess that I am disarranged by you. That is not an experience I encounter often." "I imagine not," Harry said. "What is your intention regarding the stone?" "To leave it alone and let Quirrell fail," Harry said. "His attempts will become more desperate and more visible. By February, if I've read him correctly, he'll either make a move you can clearly identify and respond to, or the body he's using will give out. Either way, the stone survives." He paused. "Unless you feel like moving it somewhere actually unreachable, in which case all of this becomes simpler." Dumbledore looked at him. "Somewhere actually unreachable. The protections are good," Harry said. "The three-headed dog is charming. But they were built to stop a human practitioner, not the thing that's in Quirrell. The level of challenge is approximately right for a gifted student, which suggests it was built to a different threat model." A pause that was not comfortable. "It was built in some haste," Dumbledore said. "I know," Harry said. "I'm not criticizing the work. I'm saying the gap between the threat you anticipated and the threat you actually have is something worth addressing." Dumbledore looked at him with those bright blue eyes, and in them something had shifted. The careful management had not gone, would not go, was too much a part of how the man operated to absent itself. But underneath it something had opened, a genuine attention, the real thing under the performance of warmth, and it was, Harry thought, a much more interesting mind than the comfortable grandfather presentation suggested. "I would like to understand you better," Dumbledore said. "If you're willing." "I'm willing," Harry said. "Provided the understanding goes both ways." Dumbledore smiled, and this time it was the real smile, smaller and less polished than the public one and considerably more genuine. "That seems fair," he said. They talked for an hour. Not about the stone specifically, not about Voldemort specifically. About magic, its history, its nature, the question of what it fundamentally was and where the limits of the current understanding sat. Dumbledore was the finest mind in the contemporary wizarding world and engaged with these questions with the genuine enthusiasm of someone who had never stopped finding them interesting. Harry offered observations from a vantage point that Dumbledore had no access to, and Dumbledore offered 70 years of accumulated human magical understanding that Harry found genuinely valuable. It was, Harry thought, the best conversation he'd had in this body. When he stood to leave, Dumbledore said, "The third-floor corridor." The night of October 31st. Harry turned. "You were there," Dumbledore said. "The protections were pressed on from outside and then restored. The magical signature of the restoration is, I have been studying it for 3 weeks and I have not been able to identify what kind of magic was used to reset them." He looked at Harry over his spectacles. "Because it wasn't wand magic. It wasn't any magic I have a category for." "No," Harry said. "What did you say to him?" Dumbledore said. "Voldemort." Harry thought about the corridor, the cold air, the doubled presence in Quirrell's face, the genuine surprise and the question, "What are you?" "The truth," he said. Which he found more disorienting than any curse I could have used. He went back to Gryffindor Tower. December arrived the way December arrives in Scottish castles, with cold that was not merely cold but an argument about the nature of cold, the kind that settled into the stones and made the fire the only honest claim on warmth in any room. The Quidditch pitch frosted over. The lake developed a rim of ice that extended further every morning. The owls came in from outside with a vaguely offended quality. Harry spent his evenings with Hermione and Neville in their corner of the common room, working through various things simultaneously, homework, which he handled efficiently and without complaint because the work itself was interesting even when the level was not challenging, Hermione's ongoing research into primordial magical theory, which had developed its own organizational system and several pages of cross-referenced notes, and Neville's herbology, which had become, over the past 3 months, something considerably more than classwork. Neville had a talent that his teachers had not yet correctly identified. It wasn't simply that plants responded to his attention, though they did, they thrived under it, grew with the specific eagerness of things that have been correctly understood, produced in November what they shouldn't have produced until March. What Neville had was a quality of attention that was indistinguishable from care, a focused, patient awareness that recognized what a thing needed and provided it. His herbology marks had gone from average to excellent in the space of 3 weeks. Harry noticed when Neville's marks went up. He also noticed that Neville had started sitting differently in classes, not in the small, contained posture of someone trying to be overlooked but in the slightly more expanded posture of someone beginning to believe they have a right to the space they're occupying. He said nothing about it directly. He just made a point, in Neville's hearing, of mentioning to Hermione that the Longbottom line had produced some of the finest herbologists and combat practitioners in wizarding history, which was true, and watching Neville's expression from the corner of his eye while he said it. Hermione caught him doing this and gave him a look that meant she knew exactly what he was doing. He gave her a look back that said yes, and she went back to her notes. The first snowfall came in mid-December, and the school emptied for Christmas, most students going home and leaving the castle with the strange expansive quiet of a large space suddenly underpopulated. Harry stayed, as he'd planned. Hermione went home with her parents, departing with a list of books she wanted and a slightly reluctant quality that suggested she would have stayed if staying had seemed like a socially acceptable option. Neville left for his grandmother's house with Trevor in his pocket and a set of herbology notes that had Harry's handwriting on about a third of the pages. Christmas Day was quiet and cold and full of the castle's particular winter self, the fires burning high, the portraits conducting their own conversations across empty corridors, Hagrid doing something in the entrance hall with a tree that required 3 attempts and a great deal of encouragement. Harry had a small pile of presents, something from Hermione that turned out to be a book she'd found called the UR Compendium of Pre-Wand Magical Practice, with a note that said Chapter 12 specifically, "Tell me if I'm right," something from Neville that was a small potted plant with a tag in Neville's careful handwriting explaining that the plant was called a shadow fern and grew best in complete darkness, and something from Hagrid that was a large box of his own baked goods and a letter written in the affectionate, sprawling handwriting of someone who had spent a great deal of effort on the composition. And an invisibility cloak. It arrived with no card. Folded into a neat silver-gray rectangle in the bottom of a box that contained only it, the fabric doing that particular thing that invisibility cloaks do in the light, going not invisible but the color of nearby air, the shimmer that is not quite iridescence and not quite transparency. There was a note. "Your father left this in my possession. I think it's time it was returned to you. Use it well." No signature. Harry held the cloak for a long moment. He didn't need an invisibility cloak. The concept of Harry Potter needing to hide from things was absurd on its face. But it was his father's, and the fabric still had something of its previous owner in the weave, not a magical impression, just the faint material record of years of use, the specific stretch at one corner where someone had held it most often, the smell of old cedar and something warm and human. He folded it carefully and put it at the bottom of his trunk, on top of the photograph. He went to the library that evening, the castle quiet and firelit, the corridors mostly empty, the library dark and cold except where he lit the lamps. He'd been meaning to investigate the restricted section for 2 months and kept finding other things more immediately interesting. Now, in the empty school, with the stone outside and the snow falling on the grounds, seemed like the right time. He didn't need a note from a teacher and he didn't use the cloak. He simply walked in, pulled out the library's own ladder, and began. The restricted section ran to 300-odd volumes, organized in the specific way of things that had been organized by fear rather than logic, the most dangerous texts nearest the door, the actually interesting material at the back, where presumably the fear had worn thin and been replaced with something more like resigned storage. He found, at the very back, a section that had been locked, not by a standard library lock but by several consecutive charms of increasing sophistication, the kind that accumulated not through design but through generations of different people adding their own layer to the existing ones, each one saying no, but make it more no. He dismantled them one at a time with an ease that would have appalled anyone watching, and found behind them a shelf of 9 books. He took the 9th one, the oldest, the one with no title on its spine. He sat down at the nearest table with it. The first page, in handwriting that was old enough to be in an intermediate form of English that required some parsing, read, for the student who has understood everything else and found it insufficient. This is not a book about magic. This is a book about what magic comes from. He read it straight through. At 2:30 in the morning, he closed the book and sat for a moment in the library's dark. The book described something it called the first fire, not a creation myth exactly, not in a theological sense, but an account of the origin of magical energy as a fundamental property of the physical universe, present before matter in the form it currently took, present before the conditions that allowed consciousness, present in the same way the laws of physics were present, not made, not put there, just the way things were. And it described, in the final chapter, in the handwriting of someone who had been working up to this statement for the entire preceding text, the theory that some entities in the universe were not constructions within this energy but expressions of it, not magical beings but magical states, temporary concentrations of the first fire into something local and coherent and aware. Harry set the book on the table. Outside the tall library windows, snow was still falling on the Hogwarts grounds. The lake was a dark shape beyond the snow, and the forest beyond that, and the hills beyond the forest, and beyond the hills nothing but winter sky. He thought about Vault 713 in Gringotts, the unnamed vault with the unreadable door. He thought about Ollivander saying a translation device. He thought about the mirror of Eriste showing him a table with people around it. He thought about the book's final chapter, and about the question it raised without answering, if the entity is an expression of the first fire, and the first fire is not reducible to any particular form, then the entity's embodiment as any specific thing, human, dragon, anything, is a choice. Not an assignment. A preference. A preference. Harry looked at his hands. 10-year-old hands. Small, slightly ink-stained from the evening's note-taking, the scar on the forehead above them and the wand in the holster at his wrist, the school robes, the ordinary physical specificity of a first year at Hogwarts sitting in the restricted section at 2 in the morning with ancient snow falling outside. A preference. He thought he might like this better than he'd expected to. Not just the school, not just the interesting year, not just Hermione's research and Neville's plants and Hagrid's birthday cake and the nimbus cutting through the cold morning air at the top of a dive. All of it. The whole specific, particular, unrepeatable shape of it. He put the book back in its place, relocked the shelf with the same series of charms he'd removed, and walked back through the dark castle to Gryffindor Tower. On the 3rd floor, as he passed the corridor, he felt the protections around the stone pulse once, steady, holding, undisturbed. Whatever was happening with Quirrell over the holiday, it wasn't happening here. He went to bed. In the morning, it was still snowing, and the grounds were white and unmarked and the whole world outside the windows was the specific blank brightness of winter, and the castle smelled of Christmas breakfast from 3 floors below, and Harry lay in his 4-poster bed and listened to the castle breathe for a minute before he got up. Then he went down to breakfast. Hagrid was at the long table with a stack of food and an enormous smile, and there were 3 other students staying for Christmas scattered at intervals, and the enchanted ceiling showed snow falling in the actual sky above and sent the light down through it in the cold, clear way of winter, and the portraits were awake and arguing amiably about something from 2 centuries ago, and the fire was going in both hearths at maximum commitment. Harry sat down, helped himself to eggs, and thought about nothing in particular. Which was, he was finding, its own kind of extraordinary. Chapter 6, Summer of Coiled Things. The Easter holidays arrived with the specific dishonesty of Scottish spring, bright one morning, sleet the next, the ground cycling between green and grey with the cheerful inconsistency of a climate that had never taken commitment seriously. The lake thawed fully in March, and by April the beech tree near the shore was doing its slow annual work of deciding to be alive again, and the Quidditch pitch dried out in patches, and the castle generally began its transition from winter fortress to something that remembered it was also, occasionally, a school and a landscape. Harry had won them the Quidditch Cup. This had happened in March, in a match against Hufflepuff that lasted 11 minutes and 40 seconds from whistle to catch, and which Oliver Wood had subsequently analyzed in 6 separate debriefs that Harry attended with varying levels of active participation. The victory had produced a week of celebratory chaos in Gryffindor Tower that Harry had found genuinely charming, the spontaneous noise of several dozen people who were simply, uncomplicated happy about something. He'd sat in the common room on the night of the win and watched the party happen around him and felt something he was still finding words for. Belonging, maybe. Not because he needed to belong somewhere, not because the absence of it had been painful. Just the clean, simple warmth of being in a specific place with specific people and finding that the combination was exactly right. Hermione had given him a look from across the room on that night that he'd interpreted correctly as "I see you noticing that you like it here," and responded to with a look that said "Yes, I know, leave it alone," and she'd smiled into her pumpkin juice and left it alone. Snape had given him his first grade on the third quarter potions practical, outstanding, without comment, without meeting his eyes while he wrote it, in the specific way of a man awarding something he's decided to award and not wanting to be caught in the moment of deciding. Harry had said nothing about it. He'd also said nothing about the fact that Snape had, since November, shifted the nature of his surveillance. It was the same attention, the same frequency, but with different intent now, not interrogative, not the search for the thing he was trying to identify, but something that Harry read as the specific watchfulness of a person who has reached a conclusion and is not sure what to do with it yet. Snape had filed Harry into a category that had no adjacent categories and was navigating that isolation with the pride and discomfort of a very intelligent person who didn't like not knowing where things went. Harry let it develop at its own pace. Quirrell had been ill since February. Not dramatically ill, not bedbound, not visibly failing, but present in the school with a quality that was diminishing in the specific way Harry had warned Voldemort it would, the body's deterioration accumulated by months of being used as housing for something it wasn't built to contain. His classes had been taken over by a rotating roster of substitutes. He appeared at meals occasionally, always at the end of the table, always still, always with the focused inward attention of something that was conserving itself. Harry watched him from across the hall and thought about their conversation in the corridor and thought about patience, which was the longest game of all. Exams arrived in May with Hermione's full organizational fury, timetables and color-coded revision cards and the specific magnificent anxiety of someone who had already done all the work and was now terrified that the work was insufficient. Harry revised alongside her with the genuine application of someone who found revision pleasant, which Hermione initially suspected of being performative and eventually accepted was simply true. They sat their exams on consecutive days in the Great Hall, the enchanted ceiling providing a clear blue sky that nobody was in a position to enjoy. Harry wrote each paper with the calm efficiency of someone for whom the answers were simply present, not recalled with effort but available, accessible, accurate. He answered what was asked and nothing more, because the purpose of the exercise was communication not display, and he had strong opinions about the difference. Neville passed everything. He said this to Harry with the stunned quality of someone who has tripped over good news in the dark, and Harry said, "Of course you did," with the genuine conviction of someone who had never doubted it, and watched Neville absorb this and file it somewhere that would be useful to him later. Term ended in a tumble of trunks and owls and the specific bittersweet quality of a large group of people who have been together intensely for 10 months suddenly dispersing. The train south from Hogsmeade was full of noise and the trading of addresses and promises to write and the particular combination of exhaustion and brightness that end of year produces. Harry sat in his usual compartment with Hermione and Neville and let the Scottish landscape run out behind them, turning into England in stages. He thought about the year. Quirrell had made 3 further attempts on the stone between Halloween and the end of term, each one more carefully planned and less successful than the last. The final attempt, in late April, had involved a genuinely clever approach, a sequence of enchantments designed to redirect the protection's attention rather than overcome them directly, which showed that Voldemort had been thinking. Harry had spent 2 nights in mid-April quietly reinforcing the outermost ward layer, not conspicuously, just adding depth to the existing structure, and the April attempt had run into his additions first and been unable to process them. He hadn't told Dumbledore about the reinforcements. He'd mentioned, in one of his now regular Thursday evening conversations with the headmaster, that the protections might benefit from additional attention in April. Dumbledore had looked at him for a moment and then said that he would look into it. Harry suspected Dumbledore had looked into it and found the additions already in place and had been turning them over in his mind ever since. Their Thursday conversations had become the most consistently interesting hours of Harry's week. Dumbledore was not what the school's version of him suggested, not simply the warm, omniscient grandfather, not simply the strategic manager, but a man of genuine and restless intellectual curiosity whose public warmth was real but whose private mind was something sharper and less comfortable and considerably more worth talking to. He asked questions that most people didn't think to ask and listened to the answers with the actual attention of someone who intended to use what he heard. He had the specific rare quality of being capable of genuine surprise and not needing to perform composure around it. He had said, in March, after Harry had described the structure of primordial magic as he understood it, "I have spent 70 years believing I understood the outer limits of what magic was. You've moved those limits so far out that I can't see the edges anymore." "Is that alarming?" Harry said. "Yes," Dumbledore said. "And also the most interesting thing that has happened to me in 40 years. He paused. "I find those 2 things are frequently companions." "Yes," Harry said. "They are." Dumbledore had not pushed, after their first conversation, about prophecy or destiny or Harry's role in the war to come. He had asked, once, in February, whether Harry had any intention of engaging with Voldemort directly, and Harry had said that he intended to end it when the ending was possible, cleanly and finally, and that the current year was not the moment but that he would know the moment when it came. Dumbledore had sat with this for a long time. Then he'd said that he trusted Harry's judgment on the timing, which Harry suspected was the most difficult thing Albus Dumbledore had ever said to another person. He respected it enormously. The train arrived at King's Cross. The Dursleys were there, Vernon with the expression of a man doing something he'd committed to and wished he hadn't, Petunia with her hands clasped and her eyes finding Harry immediately and doing that complicated thing they always did now, registering him with the specific awareness she'd developed over the year of letters and the particular quality of the space between them. Dudley was also there, considerably broader than he'd been in September, and was looking at Harry with an expression that had moved, over the course of the year, from residual instinctive fear to something more like cautious, uncertain curiosity. Harry went over to them, Trunk on his trolley, Hedwig on her cage on top of that. He shook Vernon's hand. Vernon looked briefly as though he might have a cardiac event, and then looked as though he'd decided the cardiac event wasn't worth having, and shook back with the compressed dignity of a man making an effort he hadn't known he was capable of. "Good journey?" Petunia said. "Excellent," Harry said. "Scotland is beautiful." They drove to Privet Drive in silence that was different in kind from every previous silence in this car, not the tense, edged silence of managed fear, but the almost ordinary silence of people who have an established arrangement and are operating within it. Harry looked out the window. The streets of Surrey were exactly as he'd left them, familiar, small, possessed of their particular modest suburban certainty. He found he was glad to see them. He put Hedwig in the small bedroom's window and unpacked his trunk and spent the first evening of the holidays sitting in the garden watching the roses and thinking about nothing specific. The roses had maintained themselves adequately in his absence, Petunia had kept the structure, which was what they needed, and they recognized his return in the specific way that plants register the presence of something that is good for them, a slight orientation, a shift in the angle of leaves. He started writing letters the next morning. Hermione first, a long one, because she'd asked him to report on his reading over the summer and he'd accumulated enough in the Hogwarts library to give her 12 pages of material plus a recommended reading list and 3 questions he'd been saving for her specifically. She wrote back within 36 hours, which was fast even by owl standards, with a letter that was exactly as long and twice as dense and contained 4 counter-questions and a note at the bottom that said, "My parents think I've joined a reading group. I haven't corrected them. I think they'd be confused by the truth." Harry wrote back, "You have joined a reading group. It's just a reading group with a somewhat unusual scope." Neville wrote less frequently but at greater length when he did, careful, thoughtful letters, the handwriting slowly improving, the content shifting over the summer from reporting what he was doing to thinking through what he was learning. In June he wrote that his grandmother had let him take over one of the unused greenhouses, and the letter was 3 pages about what he was growing and why and the particular problem of achieving optimal soil composition for shade plants. Harry wrote back immediately with several suggestions and a question about the shade fern he'd received at Christmas, which had been growing on his windowsill through the year with a contentment that was almost visible. He was eating breakfast in the kitchen on the 3rd week of summer when he heard the sound. It was not a loud sound. It was actually the opposite of a loud sound, the specific concentrated crack of displaced air that indicated apparition, a sound that meant magic had occurred approximately 10 feet from the front door of number 4 Privet Drive. Harry set down his toast. Then a series of thumps. Something heavy, repeatedly, against the front door. The thumps of small hands that were hitting the door because there was no accessible doorbell, hitting it with the rhythmic insistence of something that had decided this door was the one it needed and intended to get it open. Harry opened the door. The creature on the step was small, large-eared, enormous-eyed, wearing what appeared to be an old pillowcase as a garment and vibrating with a quality that was simultaneously anxiety and determination and something that Harry, adjusting to the specific sensory signature of what he was looking at, identified as a house elf at the extreme edge of its own capacity for something. It looked at him. He looked back. "Harry Potter," it said, in a voice that was like several voices trying to occupy the same frequency. "Harry Potter must not go back to Hogwarts." Harry stepped aside. "Come in," he said. "You look like you've been traveling." The elf stopped. Then it came inside, into the hall, looking at everything with those enormous eyes in the specific way of a creature that had been in a great many houses and was making rapid comparisons. Harry closed the door. "What's your name?" he said. "Dobby, sir." "Dobby the house elf." He stopped, looked at Harry with an expression that had added wonder to the existing mixture of anxiety and determination. Harry Potter let Dobby in. Harry Potter asked Dobby's name. "Yes," Harry said. "Do you want tea?" "I'm not sure if house elves drink tea but I find it improves most conversations." Dobby looked at him for a long moment. His eyes were doing something that was going to become crying in a minute if it kept going in the direction it was going. "Dobby has come to warn Harry Potter," he said. "There is a plot. A terrible plot. Harry Potter must not go back to Hogwarts this year or Harry Potter will be in terrible danger." Harry said, "Sit down, Dobby." Dobby sat on the floor of the hall, cross-legged, still vibrating. Harry sat on the stairs. He looked at the elf, and Dobby looked back at him with those wide wet eyes, and Harry thought about how to have this conversation in a way that gave Dobby what he'd come here for, the chance to do a thing that mattered to him, to deliver his warning, to make an effort on behalf of something he believed in, while also being clear about what Harry actually knew. "Tell me about the plot," Harry said. Dobby told him. In pieces, circuitously, with several interruptions where he threatened to punish himself for saying too much or saying too little, which Harry put a stop to each time by saying quietly, "Dobby, continue," and which Dobby responded to each time with a brief startled stillness and then continued. The story emerged in its shape, a plan by someone. Dobby would not name them, would not be made to name them, had protections around the name that were built from old loyalty and deeper fear, to have terrible things happen at Hogwarts this year, dangerous things, ancient dangerous things. A plot that had been waiting, Dobby said, for many years. Something connected to the school's past. The chamber, Harry said. Dobby's whole body contracted. The Chamber of Secrets, Harry said. Someone intends to open it. Dobby was doing something that was clearly simultaneous to screaming and not screaming, the absolute containment of a response he couldn't afford to voice, every muscle rigid. He said, in a voice that was all that was left after everything else was pressed away, Dobby cannot say. You don't need to say, Harry said. I know about the chamber. I know what's in it. He looked at Dobby steadily. The person who wants to open it, they've been planning this since before the war ended. The chamber it's a weapon, Dobby. Someone wants to use it as a weapon. Dobby looked at him with those enormous eyes. Harry Potter knows, he said, in a voice that had given up its equilibrium entirely. Harry Potter already knows. I suspected, Harry said. You've confirmed it. But Harry Potter must not go back, Dobby said, returning to his original position with the persistence of something that has committed to a direction. Harry Potter will be in danger. Harry looked at him. Who told you I would be in danger? No one told Dobby, Dobby said. Dobby feels it. Dobby has served great wizarding families for many years, and Dobby knows when a young wizard is being walked into danger by those who should protect him. The wide eyes were steady now, the tears not falling but present, suspended. Harry Potter is a great wizard. I appreciate that, Harry said. But I'm going to tell you something honestly, Dobby, because you've taken a real risk to come here, and that deserves honesty in return. Dobby went very still. I'm not going to be in danger, Harry said. I understand what the concern is, and I'm telling you it's not accurate. There isn't anything in that school that is dangerous to me. He said it plainly, without performance, without the elaborate scaffolding people usually constructed around large claims. The things people think would threaten me, they don't. And the person who is planning to open the chamber is also not someone I'm afraid of. Dobby looked at him for a very long time. The enormous eyes were doing their work, reading something in Harry that Harry knew he couldn't articulate but could feel being read, the specific quality of the statement, the absence of bravado in it, the flatness of a simple fact. Harry Potter is not afraid, Dobby said slowly. Not of this, Harry said. Dobby has heard that before, Dobby said. From wizards who were afraid. I know, Harry said. They sound different. Dobby looked at him, and in the enormous green eyes something shifted, the anxiety reorganizing itself, not disappearing but settling into a different configuration, the way water settles when the thing disturbing it is removed. Will Harry Potter be careful? Dobby said, which was, Harry thought, the bravest possible retreat from a position Dobby had staked a great deal on. I will be attentive, Harry said. That's better than careful. Dobby sat on the floor of the hall for another minute, processing. Then he said, very quietly, who is Harry Potter? That's a question I seem to be answering a lot lately, Harry said. The short version, something very old in a very new wrapper. Something that has been here before and intends to be here again. He looked at Dobby. You're going to be all right, Dobby. I mean that specifically about you, not generally. Dobby blinked. Then, slowly, something that might have been a smile did something on his face. Harry Potter is very strange, he said. Yes, Harry said. I know. After Dobby left, operating with another sharp crack, looking more settled than he'd arrived, which Harry counted as a reasonable outcome, Harry went back to the kitchen and ate the rest of his toast, which was cold now, and thought about what Dobby had confirmed. The Chamber of Secrets. Opened by a parcel-mouth, accessible via the school's original plumbing, containing a basilisk that had been growing in the dark for 1,000 years. He'd known about the chamber from the moment the Sorting Hat had told him he was older than the school. The chamber was a part of Hogwarts history that was woven into the castle's structure, and he'd felt it the first time he'd felt the castle's full depth, a sealed-off space in the lower architecture with a specific quality of contained age. The basilisk itself he'd felt too, a presence in the deep basement, massive, old by snake standards, profoundly lonely in the way that things get lonely when they've been in one place in the dark for 1,000 years with nothing to do. He'd felt it and noted it with the specific fellow feeling of one very old thing for another. Someone had an artifact. Something left by Voldemort, something that could act, that could possess, that could open the chamber through another hand. He hadn't been able to determine the shape of it yet, not from Dobby, who didn't know specifics, not from anything in the school's available information. But the architecture of the plan was clear enough: an object, a student, the chamber, the basilisk. A weapon deployed inside Hogwarts by something that could walk through the school without being identified. He wrote to Hermione that afternoon, "What do you know about objects enchanted to hold a fragment of a person's consciousness?" She wrote back in 2 days, "I know about Horcruxes. I found the theory in a book I'm not going to name because I don't want this letter intercepted by anyone with a knowledge of dark artifacts." "Why are you asking?" He wrote, "Because I think there's one at Hogwarts. Can you find everything available on their vulnerabilities?" She wrote, "I can." Harry, a Horcrux would mean he wasn't just diminished after Godric's Hollow. It would mean he prepared for the possibility of dying. It would mean there might be more than one. He wrote, "Yes." She wrote, "Oh." He wrote, "I know." She wrote back 3 days later with 12 pages of notes. The rest of summer moved at a pace that suited him: long mornings reading, afternoons in the garden, evenings writing letters or sitting on the back step watching the dark come in over the rooftops. Petunia brought him tea sometimes without being asked. Vernon said good morning and good evening with the consistency of a man practicing a habit he'd decided to acquire. Dudley knocked on his bedroom door in late July and stood in the doorway for a moment and said, "Were you always like that?" "Like what you are." Harry said, "Yes." Dudley stood in the doorway a bit longer. "The garden looks good," he said, and left. Harry thought this was probably the most honest conversation he and Dudley had ever had, and felt genuinely fond of him for it. The letter from Hogwarts came in early August, and with it the second-year book list, and with the book list an additional note in McGonagall's precise hand about the new defense against the dark arts professor, a Gilderoy Lockhart, whose books constituted the entire defense reading list for the year. Harry looked at the list. He had read all 7 of Lockhart's books in May, when the Hogwarts library had received new stock, in the 2 hours between lunch and dinner on a Tuesday. He had found them interesting in the specific way that very well-constructed fiction is interesting: the prose was excellent, the pacing strong, the central character compelling, the relationship to actual factual events he'd been able to cross-reference as approximately zero. He wrote to Hermione, "Lockhart." She wrote back, "I know. I'm choosing to remain optimistic." He wrote, "That's very mature of you." She wrote, "I've read his books 4 times. He wrote, "Hermione." She wrote, "I know." The day before September 1st, Harry packed his trunk again. The stone. The photograph. The library book about deep-sea creatures, which he'd read 3 more times over the summer and found newly interesting in a chapter about creatures that generated their own light in total darkness, carrying their illumination with them through environments designed to extinguish it. He put the UR compendium in and the 9 books from Flourish and Blots he'd acquired over summer trips, which had required a cab journey and Petunia's cooperative non-engagement. He put in the shade fern from the windowsill, which he'd repotted into a traveling pot and covered with a dark cloth. At the bottom, the photograph. The invisibility cloak on top of it. He'd taken the cloak out twice over the summer, not to use it, just to hold the fabric and feel its specific texture, the way it ran cool through the fingers, the way it reflected no light but also absorbed none. He'd thought about his father with the specific approach to the past that was available to someone who had been many things and in many forms: not grief, not in the ordinary sense, but something that acknowledged loss with the directness of something that had no particular distance from it. James Potter had been 21. He had been loving and brave and foolish in equal measure and had died for his family without hesitation. These were facts, and Harry held them as facts, and the feelings that came with the facts were not managed but present, available, real. He thought his father would have found the situation funny. Probably would have found Harry funny, the gravity of him, the specific ancient weight in a first-year's body, the way he'd probably have explained himself to James Potter as something old, and James Potter would have said something like, "Yeah, but what house though?" He thought this made him smile, briefly, in the quiet of the bedroom. He closed the trunk. In the morning, the cab arrived at 6 and he loaded his trunk in Hedwig's cage and sat in the back seat and watched little Whinging go past in the early light, the ordinary streets with their ordinary houses and the particular modest certainty of a place that knew what it was. Petunia stood in the doorway when he left. He turned at the gate and looked at her, and she was standing in her dressing gown in the early morning with her arms folded against the cold and her pale blue eyes doing that complicated thing, and he raised one hand. She raised one back. King's Cross was its usual organized chaos, now familiar. He found the barrier between platforms 9 and 10 and walked through without breaking stride. The Hogwarts Express was there, scarlet and steaming, and the platform was full and loud and smelled of autumn and anticipation. He found Hermione first, because Hermione found him. She came through the crowd with a purpose and a look on her face that meant she'd been thinking about something all summer and was ready to deliver the results, and she handed him a folder of notes before she said hello, which he chose to interpret as the warmest possible greeting. "Chapter 12 of the UR Compendium," she said. "I've been through it 4 times. The theory about consciousness fragments and containment objects, it's consistent with everything I found on Horcruxes. And there's a secondary source that fell sites that I tracked down through the British Library." She paused for one breath. "Hello." "Hello," he said. "This is excellent." "I know," she said. "I'm slightly frightened by how much I know about this topic now." Neville arrived a moment later, with his grandmother, who was a small upright woman in a formidable hat and the bearing of someone who had decided to take up as much space as her actual dimensions and was committed to that decision. She looked at Harry with sharp, clear eyes. He met them. "Augusta Longbottom said, 'You've been good for my grandson.'" "He's been good for himself," Harry said. "I've just been nearby." She looked at him for another moment with those sharp eyes, then nodded, once, sharply. "Good answer," she said, and turned to say goodbye to Neville, which she did with a fierce, compressed affection that Neville received with the slightly overwhelmed expression of someone who was still learning how to accept care directly. Harry watched this and thought about the mirror of Eriste and the table and the people around it. They boarded the train. Moving through the carriages looking for space, Harry felt the train's familiar quality, the accumulated magic and motion of generations of students, the specific enchantments that kept a 19th-century steam engine running reliably into the 21st century, the layered history of a vehicle that had been going back and forth on this journey since before most of the people who now depended on it were born. Through the carriage windows, London gave way to the home counties and then to the Midlands and then to the north, and Harry sat across from Hermione with the folder of notes between them and Neville's newest herbology notebook on the table beside it, and outside the window England moved at pace. He felt it when they crossed into Scotland, not a formal border, not a line marked on anything, but a quality change in the land itself, the hills getting more serious, the sky getting bigger, the whole landscape taking on the specific weight of somewhere that hadn't spent its geological history worrying about being convenient. And under everything, just at the edge of his awareness, a kind of gathering. He thought about Dobby's warning. He thought about Hermione's folder and the 12 pages on Horcruxes. He thought about the chamber in the deep foundations of the castle, sealed for 50 years, containing something that had been waiting in the dark with patient, cold, ancient hunger. He thought about whoever had the diary, because it was a diary, he'd been almost certain of it for 2 months, Voldemort's preferred format for a piece of his own soul, something that looked like a book and wrote back. He thought about who at Hogwarts would be given an object like that and whether they would know what it was. He thought about Draco Malfoy, who was intelligent and proud and deeply uncertain about several things he presented as certainties, and who had a father who had been present at the center of the last war and was still present at the center of whatever was building now. "You've gone quiet," Hermione said, from behind her notes. "I'm thinking," Harry said. "You think like other people breathe," she said, without looking up. "It doesn't produce quiet the way regular thinking does." I'm thinking about the Malfoys, Harry said. She looked up. Neville looked up. Lucius Malfoy, Harry said. He was a Death Eater who claimed coercion after the war. He has access to Voldemort's artifacts from before the First War. He has a son at Hogwarts who is currently in the same year as us. He paused. If someone wanted to deploy an artifact inside Hogwarts through a student who wouldn't ask the right questions about what they'd been given, Draco wouldn't know, Neville said, slowly. Would he? That it was, what it was. Probably not, Harry said. Which is exactly the point. Hermione set down her notes. So someone is going to give Draco a Horcrux. Or already has. And when the chamber opens and people start getting hurt, the trail is going to lead to the artifact and the artifact is going to be difficult to find, Harry said. And easy to misdirect away from. You could stop it, Hermione said. Before it starts. I could take the diary, Harry said. I know where Malfoy is going to put it and how he's going to do it. He'd worked this out in the second week of August and had been sitting with it since. But if I remove it before it does anything, I don't learn what I need to learn. What do you need to learn? Neville said. How many there are, Harry said. The diary is one. But Voldemort planned for dying, he didn't build one anchor against that possibility, he built several. The diary is the one I can find from here. The others, he paused, I need the diary to tell me where to look. Hermione absorbed this. You want to let it run far enough to get information. Far enough, yes. Not further. There are going to be attacks, she said. People petrified. Maybe worse. I'm going to make sure there are no deaths, Harry said. I can't prevent the petrification without revealing more than I want to reveal right now. But I can make sure that what happens doesn't kill anyone. Can you? She said. Not doubting him. Genuinely asking. He thought about the basilisk in the deep dark of the chamber, coiled in the ancient water, patient and vast and entirely without malice, a creature that had been given a purpose 1,000 years ago and had been following it ever since in the absence of any instruction to stop. He thought about what it would feel like to that creature, in its 1,000-year dark, to hear a voice in the language it had always waited for. Yes, he said. The train ran north through the Scottish hills, and the light changed the way it changed here, deepening, going amber and then purple, the shadows coming long and early as the hills closed around the line and the sky narrowed to the corridor above the valley. In an hour they'd be at Hogsmeade. Harry looked out the window at the hills going past in the fading light, and thought about the year ahead with the specific quality of attention he brought to things that were about to become important. The chamber would open. Something would happen. He would let it develop far enough to learn what he needed to learn. And then he would go down. Chapter 7, The King Beneath the School. The attacks began in November. Mrs. Norris First, Filch's cat, found rigid in the corridor near the second-floor bathroom on Halloween night, petrified but alive, her eyes gone the flat silver of stopped clocks. Then, 3 weeks later, Colin Creevey, who had been following Harry around since September with a camera and genuine uncomplicated admiration that Harry had found difficult to discourage without being cruel. Found on a staircase with his camera melted and his eyes the same silver stillness. Then Justin Finch-Fletchley and nearly headless Nick in December, which had produced the specific panic of a school confronting the fact that even its ghosts were not safe. The castle's atmosphere changed in the way that atmospheres change under sustained fear, not dramatically, not all at once, but in accumulation, a slow shifting of the baseline, the way a room changes when the temperature drops degree by degree rather than all at once. Students moved through corridors in groups. Conversations went quieter in the evenings. The staff held emergency meetings that weren't officially emergency meetings and were attended by everyone and resolved nothing publicly, which communicated more about the situation than any official announcement could have. Harry had found the diary in October. Draco Malfoy had brought it back from summer, looking at it the way people look at things they've been told are important and aren't sure they believe it, with the specific mix of possession and uncertainty of someone carrying an authority he doesn't fully understand. Harry had observed it at the Slytherin table on the second day of term, a plain black diary in Malfoy's school bag, no markings on the cover, a quality of contained wrongness that Harry had recognized from 15 feet away. He'd sat with that recognition for a week, watching to see who Malfoy would give it to. It had ended up with Ginny Weasley, in a cauldron of school supplies at Diagon Alley, Lucius Malfoy's work, Harry had concluded, the passing accomplished in the crowd with the casual ease of someone who had practiced exactly this kind of misdirection. Ginny Weasley was 11 years old and homesick and carrying the specific vulnerability of a youngest child who had grown up in the enormous warm shadow of a large family and was now, for the first time, entirely on her own. Harry had watched her through October with the steady attention of someone who knew what was coming and needed to understand the pace of it. The diary was working on her, drawing her confidence, replacing it with something else's, building the specific architecture of possession with the patient craftsman's approach of a consciousness that had done this before and knew where the doors were in a young person's sense of self. He'd made sure, in October and November, that every corridor the basilisk was moving through was empty when it moved. This required knowing where the basilisk was, which required listening, not with ears, but with the extended awareness he kept running at low frequency through the castle's stonework, feeling the vast slow movement of something enormous in the pipes, tracking it the way you track a ship by the displacement it makes in water. The basilisk moved at night. It moved through the plumbing, which was the only system in Hogwarts wide enough to accommodate something 50 feet long and 3 feet across. It found its victims by the direction of sound, it had been in the dark for 1,000 years and its hearing was extraordinary, and deployed its gaze through reflections, because Salazar Slytherin, whatever his failures of character, had been genuinely brilliant, and the specific design of this particular weapon showed it. A direct gaze killed. A reflected gaze petrified. A basilisk deployed with tactical intelligence in a school full of reflective surfaces was a weapon of considerable specificity. Harry had, on 3 occasions, redirected its path by making sounds in alternative corridors at the precise moment the creature was choosing its route. On one occasion this had required him to be in the astronomy tower at 2 in the morning tapping the wall in a specific rhythm, which he'd found somewhat undignified but effective. He had not yet gone down to the chamber. He needed the diary to tell him what the diary knew, not by reading it, which would require a human psyche to engage with it and provide the purchase it needed to begin working, but by being near it and feeling the edges of what it contained. He'd been doing this since October, proximity, short durations, the specific attentiveness of someone reading a closed book by the quality of what came through the cover. By December he had what he needed. 2 more Horcruxes beyond the diary. One was a ring, old, a gaunt family heirloom, hidden in a ruined house in Little Hangleton. One was a locket, Slytherin's locket, the real one, not the fake that was currently in the Ministry's possession as a matter of public record. He couldn't locate the locket specifically from here but he knew its nature and he knew it existed. The ring and the locket. The diary. And Voldemort himself, diminished, embodied in fragments and shadows and borrowed forms. 4 pieces of a person who had been trying for decades to make himself impossible to kill and had succeeded in making himself something that could not quite live. He had been turning this over all term, the way he turned old problems over, without urgency, without anxiety, just the steady patient rotation of a problem being examined from every available angle. Ginny Weasley's condition deteriorated through January. She was losing time, coming back to herself in corridors she didn't remember walking to, finding mud on her robes she couldn't account for, growing thinner and quieter and more inwardly focused with the specific quality of someone whose internal space was being colonized by something else. Harry watched her from a careful distance and also watched Ron Weasley, who was watching his sister with the helpless, frustrated anxiety of a 12-year-old boy who knew something was wrong and had no tool in his available kit that could address it. Ron Weasley was, Harry had concluded over a year and a half, someone worth paying attention to. Not because he was like Harry, he wasn't, at all, not in any visible respect, but because he had a quality that was rarer than intelligence and harder to name. He was honest in a bone-deep way that had nothing to do with intention and everything to do with construction. He couldn't sustain a pretense for more than about 45 seconds. Everything he felt showed up on his face in the order it arrived. He was fiercely loyal and sometimes foolish and had a specific courage that wasn't the dramatic charging at things variety but the quieter kind, the kind that keeps going after the adrenaline has gone and there's nothing left to rely on but the decision you made earlier. He'd started talking to Ron in November, when Ron had come to Harry with the specific helplessness of someone who needed to tell someone something and had run out of other options. Harry had listened and said very little, because Ron needed to think out loud rather than receive information, and Harry understood that about him. He'd said, at the end of that conversation, stay close to her. Don't try to fix it. Just be present. Ron had looked at him for a moment. Is she going to be all right? Yes, Harry said. Ron had held his gaze, trying to determine if it was a reassurance or a promise. He must have found something in Harry's expression that answered the question, because his shoulders came down about an inch. Okay, he said. February passed. March. The school tightened around its fear and Harry moved through it with the unhurried attention of someone who had been watching the shape of things develop and could see the point at which they would need to change. It came on a Wednesday night in the second week of April. Harry was in the library when he felt it, not the basilisk's usual slow nocturnal movement through the pipes but something else, a disturbance in the lower castle that was not physical. A door, somewhere deep below. Opening. He closed his book. He went to find Hermione first. She was in the common room, where she'd been working on a charms essay with the focused misery of someone who finds the subject matter beneath her ability but is committed to doing it justice anyway. He sat down across from her and she looked up and read something in his face immediately. Now, she said. Yes, he said. She put down her quill. Do you need anything from us? Stay here, he said. Keep Neville and Ron with you. Keep people calm. Ron's going to want to go after Ginny, she said. Tell him I'm going, Harry said. Tell him she'll be back before morning. Hermione looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, come back. I will, he said. That's not, I know you'll be fine. Obviously. But, she stopped. Looked at the table. Looked back up. Come back and tell us what happened. I want to know everything. Don't give me the condensed version. Every detail, he said. Every single one, she said firmly, and picked her quill back up, which was the most Hermione way of saying goodbye that he could imagine. He walked out of the common room and into the castle's night. The castle at midnight had a quality he'd come to know well over 2 years, not empty, exactly, because the portraits were always awake and the ghosts were always somewhere and the specific living intelligence of the building itself never slept. But quiet in a way the daytime wasn't, the human noise cleared away to reveal the older sounds underneath it, the settling of stone, the movement of water in the walls, the wind off the lock finding every gap in the ancient mortar. He went to Myrtle's bathroom on the second floor. The entrance to the chamber was in the second-floor girls' bathroom, which had been out of service since Moaning Myrtle's death half a century ago, a ghost generated by the same event that had sealed the chamber, Myrtle having had the catastrophic misfortune of being in the wrong bathroom at the wrong time. The plumbing in here was different from the rest of the floor, older, the bronze fixtures tarnished to the color of old autumn leaves, the mirrors fogged with a quality that had nothing to do with steam. Myrtle was present. She materialized from inside one of the toilet cubicles with the specific entrance of a ghost who has been doing the same dramatic manifestation for 50 years and has refined it to its essence. Oh, she said, looking at Harry. You. Hello, Myrtle, he said. She regarded him with the complicated expression she always used on him, not quite the mournful performance she deployed for most living people, but something more wary, the expression of a creature that perceived more than it admitted to perceiving. She'd been in this bathroom for 50 years. She'd felt the chamber below her for 50 years. She knew things she didn't talk about, because talking about them required acknowledging what she'd understood about that night and she wasn't ready to. She went through the sink, Myrtle said. The red-haired girl. An hour ago. She looked terrible. I know, Harry said. Thank you. Are you going down? Myrtle said. Yes. Myrtle looked at him for a moment with those silver-gray eyes that had no living light in them but had a different kind of seeing. "What's down there?" she said. Not asking for information, asking for confirmation of something she'd felt for 50 years and had never been able to have confirmed. "Something old," Harry said. "Something that should have been spoken to a long time ago." He looked at the sink. The snake-carved taps, the specific enchantment in them that was old enough to have the quality of something built when magic was practiced differently, less precise, less theoretical, more direct, the magic of someone who had spoken to the material of the world without intermediary. Parseltongue had been the original language of it, open. Harry opened his mouth and the sound that came out was not quite the sound a human throat was supposed to produce, a sliding syllabic sequence that existed in the register where language becomes something more like music, where meaning is carried in texture and pitch rather than in discrete sounds. It was Parseltongue as it had originally been spoken, not the diminished inherited gift of a boy touched by Voldemort's fragment, but the original form, older, fuller, the language of something that had spoken to serpents when serpents were a newer and stranger thing than they were now. The sink descended. The pipe revealed itself. Harry looked at it for a moment. Then he took his jacket off, folded it on the counter, and stepped into the pipe. The descent was long and cold and smelled of deep earth and water and stone that had never seen the surface. He moved through it with the easy physicality of someone who had spent 2 years learning what this body was capable of, which was more than most people assumed when they looked at a 12-year-old. The tunnel leveled out at the bottom, and he walked. The Chamber of Secrets was exactly what it was and nothing else. It was vast, that was the first thing, the scale of it asserting itself through the dark before anything else was visible, the sense of ceiling far overhead and walls far back, a space that had been built to hold something large. The floor was a centimeter of still water over stone, the torches along the walls burning with the cold blue-green light that Slytherin had favored, the chamber's structural pillars carved with serpents that were not decorative but functional, the enchantment in the carving still running after 1,000 years with the specific durability of magic that was built from genuine understanding rather than applied theory. At the far end, a stone statue of Salazar Slytherin, 60 feet high, looking out over the chamber with the expression of someone who had built something he was proud of and was waiting to see it used. In front of the statue, on the wet stone floor, Ginny Weasley, very still, her robes soaked through, her red hair spread out around her head. Her eyes were open and very slightly glazed, the specific quality of someone who was still present but at an extreme distance from themselves, consciousness held at arm's length by something that had been steadily moving her out of her own interior space for months. Standing over her, holding a plain black diary, was Tom Riddle. Not the diary's projection, not a ghostly image or a pale imitation. Something more solid than that, more present, built from the life force that the diary had been drawing out of Ginny since September, the specific awful alchemy of a consciousness that could exchange someone else's vitality for its own substance. He was tall, dark-haired, handsome in the specific arranged way of someone who had considered his appearance carefully, wearing the school robes of 50 years ago. He turned when Harry came through the far door. The expression on his face was one Harry had been curious about, how Tom Riddle, at 16, in this form, would respond to the sight of Harry Potter walking into the chamber alone. What he got was a smile. "I wondered if you'd come yourself," Tom said. His voice was smooth and deep, the voice of someone who had practiced speaking as a performance. "I rather hoped you would." Harry walked forward. Not toward Tom specifically, toward the chamber's center, where the water was deepest and the acoustics of the space gathered sound and held it. He walked with the same unhurried certainty he'd walked toward the troll with, toward the corridor outside Vault 713 with, toward every situation that had believed it had something over him and been mistaken. He was looking at the chamber more than at Tom. It was extraordinary work. The serpent columns, the enchanted water, the specific geometry of the space that was not merely architectural but functional, a resonance chamber, in the most literal sense, designed to amplify the voice of a Parselmouth and carry it through the plumbing to every connected pipe in the castle. 1,000 years old and still running. Salazar Slytherin had been, whatever else, a builder of things that lasted. "Harry Potter," Tom said, following him with his eyes. "You don't seem frightened." "No," Harry said. Ginny was frightened, Tom said, looking down at her. She was frightened for months. Every time I took a little more of her, she fought it, which is admirable, but fighting something like me with the resources of an 11-year-old girl is, he made a gesture. Where is the diary? Harry said. Tom looked at him. The smile shifted, reassessing. You want the diary? I want you to put it on the floor and step away from Ginny, Harry said, pleasantly. She needs to get warm and she needs to go back to her family. And if I don't? Harry looked at him. He gave Tom the same patient, level attention he gave everything, and watched Tom receive it the way people received it, not immediately, but in stages, the smile becoming something more careful, then more uncertain, then something that was trying to remain certain and finding the effort harder than expected. I know what you are, Tom said. I've been feeling it since the diary entered the school. There's something in you, something that made the enchantments in this chamber run differently than they should. Something that doesn't match the boy you look like. The dark eyes were working. Dumbledore's weapon. That's what I thought at first. Some construction of his, some prepared defense. I'm not Dumbledore's anything, Harry said. No, Tom said slowly. No, I don't think you are. The reassessment was happening visibly, the very intelligent mind in Tom Riddle at 16, full of itself and full of genuine capability, running the available data and finding the picture it made unsatisfying. What are you? There it is, Harry said. Everyone asks that eventually. Tell me, Tom said, and the command in it was real, not a request, not curiosity dressed as a request, but the flat authority of someone who was accustomed to acquiring information through will alone. Something that was old when Salazar Slytherin's grandfather's grandfather was still deciding what to do with the rest of his afternoon, Harry said. He looked up at the statue. He was a genuine talent. Parseltongue is a beautiful language. He'd have been better served by building this as a sanctuary rather than a weapon, but then, he had his fears, and people build weapons out of their fears more often than anything else. Tom stared at him. Put the diary down, Tom, Harry said, looking back at him. This iteration of you doesn't survive the night regardless. The question is how the next few minutes go. This iteration, Tom repeated, and the specific word choice had landed correctly. Harry could see it land, could see Tom understanding what that implied, that Harry knew about the Horcruxes, that Harry knew this was not the only copy of the problem, that the person in front of him had a wider understanding of the situation than a 12-year-old should have had access to. You know. About the ring. About the locket. About what's left of you wandering around looking for a body. Harry met his eyes. You made yourself into fragments, Tom. That was the choice. You took fear of death and built it into the architecture of your existence, and in doing that you built the fear in permanently. You can't stop being afraid now. It's load-bearing. Tom's face had done several things during this speech, the smooth control slipping in increments, the performance of confidence that was a very good performance but was only a performance. Underneath it what Harry could see was the texture he always saw in Tom Riddle, in what remained of Voldemort, in the fragment he'd spoken to in Quirrell's body in the corridor 2 years ago, the genuine, enormous, specific fear of a person who has decided that the most important thing in the world is their own continuance and has organized their entire existence around ensuring it. You're not afraid, Tom said. Of me? Not even slightly, Harry said. Why? Because I've been here before, Harry said. Not this chamber, not this body, not this particular conversation. But this moment, the moment where something I'm not afraid of is trying to determine if the fact that I'm not afraid of it should make it afraid of me. I've had this moment many times. He paused. The answer, for what it's worth, is no. I'm not your enemy in the way you're thinking. I'm something much more straightforward than that. Which is? The end of this, Harry said. Not tonight, not of everything. But of this specific story, the story where you build yourself into fragments because you're afraid and spend decades trying to reassemble them into something that can hurt enough people that the fear goes away. That story ends. I'm the reason it ends. He said it as flatly as he said everything, without drama, without performance, the way you state a fact about the weather. The chamber was silent for a long moment. Tom looked at him with those dark, brilliant eyes, and what was in them was complex in the way of someone who is very intelligent receiving information that challenges them at a level deeper than argument, not their conclusions but their premises, not what they think but what they think with. Then he opened his hand and the diary hit the water. Harry watched it fall, watched it land on the wet stone, watched the black cover darken further where the water touched it. He looked at Tom, who was standing in the chamber's cold light with the expression of someone who has made a decision they're not entirely sure they've made and is waiting to find out what it means. "Ginny first," Harry said. Tom stepped back. Harry walked to where Ginny was lying and crouched down. She was cold and very pale, her pulse present but thin, the specific quality of someone who had given a significant amount of themselves away. He put 2 fingers against her temple, not a healing gesture, not a spell, just contact, the direct communication of something warm and present to something that had gone small and distant inside itself. "Come back," he said quietly. Not a command. An invitation. "It's safe now. Come back." Ginny's eyes focused. She looked at him. Then she looked at the ceiling of the chamber. Then she pushed herself upright with the careful movements of someone reassembling their relationship with their own body, and looked around, and said, "Is it over?" "The important part," Harry said. She looked at Tom. Tom was watching her with an expression that Harry couldn't fully read, not cold, not triumphant, not the performance of either. Something that might have been, in different conditions, something like regret. Then Harry picked up the diary. He looked at it for a moment. Plain black cover, no markings, 60 years old, warm in a way that objects shouldn't be warm. He could feel the consciousness inside it, compressed and furious and afraid, all that will and intelligence reduced to this, a fragment of a person, tethered to a book, fighting for survival with the means available to it. He thought about what the book had said in Hogwarts' restricted section, an expression of the first fire. He thought about what it was to be reduced to a fragment of yourself and spend decades trying to become whole again. He did not destroy the diary. Not yet. He looked at Tom. "The ring and the locket," he said. "I'll deal with them in time. The piece of you that's currently looking for a body, that ends this year. Not by my hand specifically, but it ends." He turned the diary over once. "This, I'm keeping. Not because I intend to use it or preserve it. Because I intend to understand it first." Tom looked at the diary in Harry's hand with an expression that no person whose conscious interest in the diary was purely strategic should have had. It was the expression of someone looking at a piece of themselves. "You know what happens to me if you destroy it," Tom said. "Yes," Harry said. "All of it. Not just this, I know what a Horcrux is," Harry said. "I know what destroying them means." He held Tom's eyes. "I also know what sustaining them means. What you've done to sustain them." He let that sit. "This conversation isn't one where I'm trying to help you. I want to be clear about that. But I also want to be clear that when this ends, and it ends completely. You don't get to leave pieces of yourself hidden in dark places forever, Tom. Eventually things that hide in the dark run into me." Tom said nothing. Harry looked at him for one more moment, at the handsome, brilliant, terrified face of a boy who had decided at 10 years old that power was the answer to being afraid and had spent the next half-century proving himself wrong, and felt something that was not pity and was not contempt but occupied the specific territory between them. Something that acknowledged what was real about the person without excusing what they'd done with it. Then he turned to Ginny. "Can you walk?" "Yes," she said, with the determination of someone who was going to walk regardless of the answer. "Good," he said. "Stay close." He looked at the statue of Slytherin one more time, the vast stone face, the specific expression of someone watching from above, the serpents carved into every surface looking out with painted eyes that caught the blue-green light and threw it back. "He would have been interested in you, Tom said, from behind him. He would have been frightened of me, Harry said. Like everyone else. He walked toward the exit. The hiss he sent through the chamber ahead of him was long and low and carried in the specific frequency of the original language, the full form, the one that resonated in the stone itself and in the water and in the enchanted carvings and in the plumbing that threaded through the castle's entire structure. It said, in the language that Salazar had used when he built this place and given this creature its purpose, I know what you are. I know what was asked of you. I am releasing you from the command. The water at the far end of the chamber moved. Then the darkness moved. The basilisk came slowly, which Harry had not expected. He'd expected something defensive, something reactive, the conditioned response of a creature that had been given one purpose and was encountering interference. What came instead was slow, and careful, and vast, the movement of something that had been in one place for a very long time and was approaching a situation it had no existing category for. It came until the great blunt head was 10 feet from Harry, and it stopped. The eyes were closed. Harry looked at the closed eyes for a moment. Then he said, in Parseltongue, much more quietly, "Open your eyes." The basilisk opened its eyes. They were yellow gold, enormous, the vertical pupils black as the vault below Gringotts, old in the way that very long lives make things old, not damaged, not faded, but saturated, as though every year of existence had added a layer to the color rather than taking one away. They looked at Harry. Harry looked back. The basilisk was not petrified. The basilisk did not look away. It looked at Harry with those gold eyes and it saw the boy, yes, saw the 12-year-old in school robes standing in the chamber with his feet in an inch of water and a black diary in his hand, but also saw below that, past that, through that, in the way that very old animals sometimes see to the thing underneath the visible surface. Its head lowered. Not dramatically, not with the theater of submission, not with any performance. It simply lowered, the great head coming down until the jaw was resting on the stone in front of Harry's feet, and it held there, and the yellow gold eyes were still open and still looking at him, and what was in them now was not the conditioned ferocity of a creature with a purpose but something older and simpler than that. Recognition. Harry set his hand on the basilisk's head. The scales were warm, warmer than the water, warmer than the stone, the heat of a living thing that had been here long enough to have opinions about the temperature. "You've been alone a long time," he said, in the deep form of the language. The basilisk was still. "That's over now." He paused. "Can you leave this place?" A long, slow exhalation through the basilisk's scales, a sound like wind in a very large space. "The castle is above," Harry said. "The forest is east. You're old enough and large enough that most things will leave you alone." He considered. "The centaurs will be annoyed. But they'll adapt." The basilisk lifted its head. It looked at Harry for one more moment with those gold eyes, and Harry felt in the gaze the weight of 1,000 years of darkness and the specific quality of something that had just been given back, something it didn't know it had lost. Then it turned. It moved back through the chamber with the slow, enormous certainty of something that had already decided where it was going, toward the back passage that Harry could feel connected, through a long series of subterranean tunnels, to the forest's eastern edge. He watched it go until the darkness absorbed it. Ginny was standing behind him, very still. "Was that," she said. "Yes," he said. "And it was ready to leave," Harry said. "It just needed someone to tell it the door was open." She looked at him with the specific expression he was used to receiving, the one that started with disbelief and moved through recalibration and arrived somewhere in the vicinity of awe and wasn't entirely comfortable there. "Who are you?" she said. "Harry Potter," he said. "Come on. Let's get you back." They came up out of the chamber as the castle's clocks were striking 3 in the morning, emerging through the sink in Myrtle's bathroom into the cold air of the second floor. Myrtle was waiting. She looked at Ginny, then at Harry, then at the diary in Harry's hand. "Is it over?" she said, which was the second time someone had asked him that tonight. "That part," Harry said. She looked at him with those silver eyes, and something in her face did something unfamiliar, not the dramatic mournful performance, not the self-absorbed grief she'd been performing for half a century, but the genuine expression of someone who has just been released from a question they've been carrying too long. "I was in here when it happened," she said. "The first time. When it opened." "I know," Harry said. "I saw eyes," she said. "In the mirror. And that was all." "I know," he said again. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Thank you," which was, he thought, the first time Moaning Myrtle had thanked anyone for anything in 50 years, and he received it with the seriousness it deserved. He took Ginny to the hospital wing, where Madame Pomfrey produced the specific organized fury of a medical professional confronted with a situation that has been developing without her knowledge and applied it to Ginny's care with impressive efficiency. She sent Harry away with the flat authority of someone who had been sending students away for 30 years and had not yet met one she couldn't. Harry stood in the corridor outside the hospital wing with the diary in his hand and looked at it for a moment. He could feel the consciousness inside it, diminished now, the hours in the chamber draining from it as the conditions that had sustained it dissolved, the specific slow deflation of something cut off from its source. He thought about what Tom had said, "You know what happens to me if you destroy it." He thought about the ring and the locket, which would need to be addressed in their own time, by means he was still working out, not tonight, not this year, but before the end of the larger story. He put the diary in his inside pocket. He went to find Dumbledore. The headmaster's office was lit at this hour, which meant either Dumbledore hadn't gone to sleep or had been called back to the castle by the wards that monitored the chamber, probably both, knowing him. Harry went up without knocking. Dumbledore was at his desk with a cup of tea and the specific expression of a man who has been waiting with considerable patience for approximately 3 hours and has not entirely used the time well, which Harry read as meaning he had been worried. Fawkes was on his perch. Fawkes looked at Harry, then at the diary in Harry's hand, then let out a long, worn phrase of song that did something to the air of the room, not magic in the technical sense but in the broader sense, the sense in which certain things at certain moments have the quality of something being resolved. Dumbledore looked at the diary. Looked at Harry. "Ginny Weasley," he said. "In the hospital wing," Harry said. "She'll be fine. Madame Pomfrey has her." "The chamber." "Closed," Harry said. "The basilisk is, elsewhere." Dumbledore looked at him with those blue eyes. "The basilisk is elsewhere," he repeated. "In the forest, by now," Harry said. "It's 50 feet long and capable of killing anything that looks it in the eyes, so I'd recommend telling Hagrid to give the eastern section some space for a few weeks while it gets oriented. After that it'll probably find its own territory." He paused. "It's been alone for 1,000 years. It won't bother anyone who doesn't bother it." Dumbledore was doing the thing he did when Harry said things that required significant adjustment, going very still, the blue eyes steady, the internal processing running at speed while the external presentation remained composed. "You told it to leave," Dumbledore said. "I released it from its purpose," Harry said. "There's a difference. It was following a command. I countermanded the command in the original language." He looked at Dumbledore. "No living wizard should have been able to do that." "No," Dumbledore said. "No living wizard should have." "I know," Harry said. "I'm telling you so that when you work through the evening and arrive at that conclusion, you know I've already arrived there too and am not trying to obscure it." Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. "The diary," he said. "May I see it?" Harry considered this. "You can look at it," he said. "I'll hold it." He extended his hand. Dumbledore leaned forward and looked at the plain black cover, and Harry felt the attention the headmaster brought to it, the specific sweep of a very powerful wizard's awareness, reading the diary's nature quickly, accurately, arriving at the same conclusion Hermione had arrived at in August. "A Horcrux," Dumbledore said, very quietly. "One of several," Harry said. "This one I'm keeping. Not for long, but for now." Dumbledore looked at him. "May I ask why?" Because the consciousness in it knows where the others are, Harry said. And because having it gives me a point of contact with what remains of Voldemort that I don't have any other way. He paused. I know what I'm holding. I know what it requires. I'm not in any danger from it. No, Dumbledore said, with the specific quality of someone making a concession they've already made internally. I don't imagine you are. He sat back. He looked very, in that moment, like what he was, a very old man who had spent 70 years managing an enormous weight and who had recently had to make room, in his understanding, for something that changed the weight's nature and distribution without removing it. He looked, in that moment, genuinely tired. I want to tell you something, Dumbledore said. Go ahead, Harry said. When I first understood what you were, he said, my first instinct was to determine how to use it. How to position it. How to ensure that the extraordinary capability you represent was deployed in the service of the war that's coming. He held Harry's gaze. I want you to know that I recognize that instinct and I've been working to counter it. Harry said nothing. You are not a weapon, Dumbledore said. You are not a strategy. You are a person who has chosen to be here, for reasons that are your own, and who has done more for the safety of this school in 2 years than I have managed in the last decade. He paused. I am trying to become someone who operates accordingly. I know, Harry said. I've been watching. Is it working? Dumbledore said, which was the most unguarded question he'd ever asked Harry. Yes, Harry said. Slowly. But yes. Dumbledore looked at him, and the tired expression resolved into something else, not the warm grandfather, not the strategic manager, but the real thing underneath, the genuine man, complex and flawed and still, after everything, genuinely committed to something beyond himself. He nodded once. Go get some sleep, he said. You've had an eventful evening. Every evening is eventful, Harry said. Yes, Dumbledore said. I've noticed. Harry went back to Gryffindor Tower. The common room was lit, Hermione, Neville, and Ron in the chairs by the fire. Ron was on his feet before Harry was fully through the portrait hole, and Harry said, she's in the hospital wing, she's fine, Madame Pomfrey has her, and watched 3 people exhale simultaneously, which was its own kind of beautiful. Ron sat back down. His face was doing several things at once, relief, and the specific complicated emotion of relief after sustained fear, and something that was going to become something else when it had time to develop. He looked at Harry and said, what happened? Harry sat down on the hearth rug, his back against Hermione's chair, the diary in his pocket, the fire warm after the chamber's cold. I went down, he said. Ginny was there. I brought her back. Just, like that? Ron said. More or less, Harry said. The basilisk? Neville said, from his chair. Gone, Harry said. East. Past the forest. Hermione's hand came down from the armchair and landed on his shoulder briefly, not a hug, not making a thing of it, just contact, brief and warm and honest. Harry looked at the fire. Outside, the Scottish sky was beginning to show the particular grey-blue of 4 in the morning, the specific color of the hour when the night decides it's done but the day hasn't confirmed it yet, the hour that belonged to neither and was therefore its own strange, clean thing. He thought about the basilisk in the forest, moving through the trees in the dark, finding the eastern edge, testing the air. 1,000 years of one place, one purpose, one darkness, and now the whole forest, and beyond the forest the hills, and beyond the hills nothing but open sky and everything that lived under it. He thought about Tom Riddle still in the chamber below, diminishing, the diary in Harry's pocket now the only strong link to the world above. He thought about the ring in Little Hangleton, the locket somewhere in the dark, the pieces of a person scattered through the world like the aftermath of something that had shattered itself trying to last forever. He would find them. Not tonight. Not this year. But in time, with the specific patient certainty of something that had all the time it needed and had decided this was worth spending it on. He looked at the fire, and at his 3 friends around it, and at the castle settling into the last hours of its night. He was 12 years old and older than language, and sitting on a hearthrug at 4 in the morning with a fire warming his face and the sound of Neville quietly falling asleep in his chair and Hermione still turning pages behind him, because she was Hermione and she was going to read until the sun came up regardless of the situation. He was, he thought, exactly where he was supposed to be. Not because of a prophecy. Not because of destiny or design or any grand arrangement. But because something very old had woken up in a small cold house on a night full of grief and lightning, and had grown slowly into this shape, this life, these people, this fire. A preference, the book had said. He thought that was right. He thought this was exactly what he'd prefer.